I think as it's coming on 10 past, we'll get started. Thanks everyone for coming. This is Table of Contents, a symposium, really a second in a series organized by PhD students. I'd like to thank Milad, Lucas, and Alif for putting this together and inviting me here today to introduce it. I've got 5 golden minutes, so I thought we'd have a little time for a setup, and I'll explain the organization of the day as well. You've all read the event description, so I shan't repeat it, but I did want to sort of speak to how this idea of table of contents came about and why it might be useful in lots of different places in terms of AA research. There's this golden moment where after you've completed your OU officially approved research statement, where you've delivered now a chapter, the first chapter of your dissertation to your supervisor. You've killed yourself to develop this first chapter, and they immediately ask, give me some context. How should I receive this chapter? What is your table of contents? This is the weirdest response to giving this beautiful gift, right? They immediately want this other gift, the table of contents. And some of you might have one in mind. Some of you might imagine, I can't have a table of contents until I have content. I need chapters, and then I have a table of contents. But I would argue, at least for the purposes of today, a table of contents could come fairly early in your research and writing arc. It could be sponsored by that first chapter. I think it might be difficult to pull off a table of contents in front of any writing. But provided you have that first chapter, you might imagine where it sits as a fragment in the larger whole and develop not the table of contents that you will abide by for the next 2, 3, 4 years, but a working table of contents, a provisional table of contents. In that sense, the table of content might be a good tool as much as it is this thing that you slap at the front of a dissertation. And I think we'll talk a lot about that today. How can a table of contents be a tool about organizing thoughts, research, methodologies, not just text, but also images and diagrams. A table of contents asks you to do a bit of stock taking, and that's always healthy. And it could be that it shrinks and grows over the course of your writing. There's always this difficulty of where to begin and where to stop a doctoral project. And we'll be talking, I think, a little bit about how you conclude a table of contents today. But before we dive in, and we've got a session of 3 tables of presentations, each an hour long. I'll introduce those people and describe those sessions. But before we do that, I think we needed a pub quiz. 5 questions. We'll just get the slide up so that my visual joke can land there. Nice, thank you. I'd like to show you 5 architecturally significant tables of contents, just the table of contents, and ask you to guess the book. My hope is you'll guess all 5, and because of the power of the table of content, we'll know the author, we'll know the book, we'll know the project. Maybe we'll not know all 5, and that'll be interesting as well. Hands on buzzards, we'll begin. What's this? This is a weird one. Lots of little chapters. Look at those page runs. Some of them are sort of 9 and 10 pages. The wall veil, the wall cornice, the angle, the edge, and the fillet. What's the book? One of the most famous books of architecture. Stones of Venice, thank you. Maria gets a gold star. You get a big fat beer after this event. The Stones of Venice, published 1851 to 1853. For those of you who were around in the 1850s, you know this came out as 3 volumes. And that, in a weird way, Ruskin uses the Stones of Venice to expand an earlier work. So those are the 3 volumes. That's the Kellamscott Press first edition, first page. But it was really the Seven Lamps of Architecture, published 1849, that then sponsored the subsequent work as a kind of proof, if you will, of the Seven Lamps of Architecture. Ruskin had to write The Stones of Venice. But even here, with a table of contents, these are rather weird and enigmatic chapter headings. The lamp of life, what does that mean? So that's one strategy for a table of contents, this sort of poetic, leaving a lot of room open for yourself. I don't know how useful this Ruskinian method is. This is the table of contents of the longest running and best-selling book on architectural history ever. What is the book? Nyack gets a gold star, if not a beer. Sir Bannister Fletcher. His table of contents is quite the opposite of Ruskin. It's every little thing. It's running in, you'd think, chronological sequence, not really, only partly. And you see it has two parts. So within the table of contents, there's the historical styles and the non-historical styles. And that's all being published 1896, first edition. The History of Architecture of the Comparative Method. We usually call Sir Bannister Fletcher's a history just Sir Bannister Fletcher's. That's how famous it was. It was doubly Fletcher. It was father and son, as you recall. The father having been trained partly at the AA. But this became the cornerstone of architectural history surveys. Right from the word go, it's never been out of print, and its editions are numerous. You will find one of these books on every professor's bookcase. And you'll find this graphic that is wed to the table of contents, this so-called tree of architecture. A lot of criticism of this tree. It's hierarchical. It is completely a Western perspective, but it brings together some themes that are laid out in the table of contents, but it makes them into a graphic. So I'm interested in this notion that Fletcher looked at this as a diagram of the table of contents and a way into the project before you've turned the third page. So it might be interesting to think, are there graphics, are there diagrams that live with your table of contents or help introduce the whole of your work that would help guide subsequent research? It's so strange, Sir Bannister Fletcher's organization, he has to write a preface to explain the table of contents, which has a lot to do with what he called influences, geographical, geological, climate, etc. And then cultural influences, religion, social, political, historical, and on and on. So this helps explicate why the table of contents is organized the way it is. When you need an entire preface just to explain your table of contents, you might be going down the wrong road. But that comparative method was amazingly successful because it brought together graphics, and I'm speaking a little bit to the PhD by Design group when I mention this. And some of them are so deliciously strange that they do formulate a part of the work. These are not figures or illustrations of an idea. Embedded within those images is an idea that the text then talks to. Table of contents, the third. What is this? Who wrote this? Le Corbusier. Very good. Everybody gets a point. 1923. This translation, the first English translation, 1927, Towards an Architecture. It's interesting. Corb wrote 6 of his 7 chapters as standalone essays first, all published in L'Esprit Nouveau. That's an interesting strategy, right? To think of your work, your chapters, as being autonomous, but as a series, they aggregate into something more. So this was a strategy of Corb's. It's often a strategy of PhD students. It's difficult to write a whole book or something book length like a dissertation, but to go for a stretch, to write something like a long scholarly article as a chapter, and then to imagine how they're sequenced, that's the job of the table of contents, to make sense of that, to make the whole. Now, these are going to get a bit more tricky. This book was incredibly important to architectural history and theory. Any guesses here? It's a weird one. It starts out with typology, then it goes into 2 chapters based on architect, then it finishes with a methodology. That's a nice strategy. Not Colin Rowe, though he's implicated. Whitcower, Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism. And it too has this diagram that lets you into the whole of the project. His famous diagram, Palladian villas, reduced. And it's only once you have that series in mind that then you can read that table of contents perhaps more productively. What's nice about the Whitcower book is the addition of appendices. What are those about? How are those useful? But the exclusion of a foreword or preface, you just dive into part 1. Something more contemporary. I hope you all get this one. 1995. Not Delirious. But it is Delirious New York. That's the wrong cover. It is indeed Delirious New York. And I think so Maria gets double points. I think in this case, it's interesting to look at his way around not finishing the project. 293, appendix, a fictional conclusion. What is that about? So I think the different strategies for how you bring a project to a close, and this setup predicts that the way you finish will in no way be conclusive, but it almost sponsors all the other books Rem will write. So it does offer not only a way to take stock, but to point to subsequent work. And I would hope that's really where we'll talk to today in these 3 sessions. The 3 sessions are organized as follows. Session 1, the repository-based research, chaired by Maria Fedorchenko. And that will feature David, Sophia, Ricardo, and Alvaro presenting their table of contents. Without taking a break, we'll jump to session 2, field-based research. That's chaired by Ricardo de Hostas, featuring Andrea Mohammed and Hyun-Jae's work. We'll then take a little tea break at 4 o'clock and come back for the 3rd and final session, studio-based research, chaired by Monia DeMarchi and featuring Nina Arturo and Milaud's table of contents. We'll wrap up at this table. I'll bring those session chairs together, and we'll have an open floor Q&A to discuss the results of this. Elif is going to be our taskmaster, mistress. She's going to keep us to time. And I will ask that the sessions abide by the time. Each session will go for about an hour. Very good. Well, I will turn the floor over to Maria and her team, opening up with repository-based research. Thank you very much.
So I'm very excited to be here. The subject of research is obviously very important to me, and the way we conduct research, approach it in very dissimilar ways across the AA, I think is a really fantastic subject of investigation, because it ultimately leads us to exchange and interrogate our own methodology. I was asked by the organizers to make a very brief introduction, maybe coming from the position of how we understand research in my own unit. And I'm trying to lead into the larger questions that these amazing projects raise and hopefully will resonate across the school. So of course my unit is inherently research design. The whole point of starting a unit and running it at the AA is to bridge this very unhealthy gap that has formed, for example, in a number of American schools between history and theory curriculum and design studio curriculum. My own education was a deliberate attempt to move from the 2 professional programs to a history and theory program, and ultimately to bridge across. The depository-based research is the one we're most familiar with. or has been familiar with throughout the 20th century. Now, let me just say very quickly that it's not just this particular session, to which I'm probably mostly related, but it's actually all the sessions of today's event, I think should be considered together, because in the unit, we deliberately break away from working on one mode of researching, such as depository, field-based, or design studio experimentation-based. In fact, they often overlap, coincide, and inform one another. That doesn't mean that an enormous value can be derived from a focus and intensity of an academic exercise that a PhD would entail. But I also come from a context of immediate design application. And so 3 kinds of research often run and stagger, for example, starting with intense saturation and depository-based research, followed by the unit trips. We're going to talk about in today's session and other events, the value of travel. We do that, of course, and we do field diagnostics. We often take that quite quickly into studio-based experimentation. Now, the reason why we do all this is because we believe that not just the disciplinary depository, but also the field of the city out there had been a fantastic way to begin and animate the project. Perhaps in isolation, it's not enough. The depository-based research is extremely powerful, but I think the field-based reality test is also extremely valuable. That also allows us to challenge the previous conventions of depository-based research. I think it's really important that we start to question why history, why theory, why disciplinary projects. Some people have followed those extreme pendulum swings in the end of the 20th century. We were told intermittently to do or not do research, to do or not do a PhD. We were almost convinced of its utter uselessness, just to, of course, suffer a very natural return to the value of history, precedent, and knowledge for a long-term project. The reason I think is important to open up the discussion is, I think, yes, many things do need to change. Fixed camps led by star architecture figures, yes, that is something we should consider. Perhaps even the concept of a movement or historical canon that's fixed, defined, closed. We definitely need to consider. There are many things that were unhealthy and less productive about the historical research operating in the architectural academic scene of the 20th century. At the same time, I think there were really powerful things that we threw out with the bathwater, which means the ability to construct the project on a much more solid intellectual foundation, ability to frame the intuitive haphazard discoveries within design studio in a context of a long-term historical projects that nevertheless continue. And I think it's important to articulate our specializations, particular things that we can do really, really well, and that is not particularly camp mentality, but it's a question of disciplinary expertise. Just a few words, again, on how we then develop a certain methodology, and I think it's just partly as a provocation for some of the tensions and problems we encounter that could be discussed. We try to see research changing. Like I said, good things stay, bad things go. The good things to stay in our minds is that we can still immerse ourselves. We can saturate, we can enrich our project world with historical research, but we are free to draw our own stream of precedents, associations, friendships, and enemies, friendships and kind of battles within it. Second, the canons are fluid. History can be rewritten, affiliations can be remade. So the student, the person doing the work, is ultimately in control of what sort of historical context, what sort of priorities and affiliations will be constructed. So we put the student in the driving seat. And third, it's important to understand that oftentimes when we work on something passionately, intensely, we only see the short term. We only see the section I need to make. We don't really see the long-term repercussions. So I think it's really important that we try to get you hooked. And as also we, as teachers, we're deeply hooked on a number of subjects that actually span decades of our lives, our careers. So the importance of short-term and long-term projects. Leading into the presenters, I don't know their work. I don't know their amazing projects unraveling very well, but from what I could gather from the snippets, I think it's really important that we celebrate the work that opens up the question of mining and looking with a fresh lens on what is being found. So building on what I said our own interests are, historical depository is open to all of us to redefine. So we take what we find and we misread, misuse, we misplace. So we'll see a lot of conversations now about how something could be revisited and reaffiliated, such as a relationship between Russian and Western avant-garde or colonial and kind of dominant practices. That leads into the questions of architectural exchange. I'm really excited about the presentations that are coming now because the notion of change, travel, traffic of architecture across territories and cultures is really important. Then we're going to layer it with the questions of how the depository versus the field-based work collide, the trip, the engagement with the raw reality of the city. How is that form of education and knowledge production? Ultimately, that leads, it seems to me, that the projects that are engaged in tensions, maybe in postmodern times, they would be seen as dialectics. What dialectics? The big ones. Do we understand architecture as a clash between past, present, and future, local, global, political, aesthetic? So there were several threads that I saw running through the abstracts. And then much more architectural tensions, city architecture, figure, ground, form, and organization. But most importantly, all these dissertations are asking a most important question: what do we do now going from here? What is it, the projection into the future? So they always produce with the view of changing the way we research and design tomorrow. Thank you.
So how can I use this? Oh, it's on. Ah, okay. That's practical. It's too small. Oh, it's too small. It's fine. It's fine? Yeah. Oh, okay. Bigger? Yes, better.
Put more stuff.
Okay, thank you. My name is David. I'm sorry about this because I forgot to bring the file, the USB, so I couldn't do the presentation from there. From the my presentation is not about my research, but I will see this presentation as a reflection also for me of what I've been done in conducting my research by far. So the title, it's not clear as well. Well, the title is Excavating Evidence, a reflection on conducting archival investigation. So my research basically is a historical research, and the main problem of conducting a historical research actually is about reading the facts, because whatever the thing that we have, whatever we call as a facts in a historical research actually already happened in the past. So the problem is always how to read them, how to contextualize these facts into something, well, let's say a fresh narrative, so we can have a better or a fresh reading about these events or agents. So I think it's oh no, I think just put it like this then. Is it okay?
Yeah. If you just read it out loud, it's fine.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, I will start with what is a methodology for me. So for me, methodology has three functions, at least based on my own experience. First is to frame the research, to help me framing the research. Second is to help me excavate further information about what I need to help me supporting my assumption and to construct my argumentation. And lastly, it's about to structure the outcome narrative. And I think for the last part is entirely about the table of content. So I think every methodology needs to start with the interest. We need to start with the subject of research. And this is also what I did in my research. So I started with the topic. what I want to do. So like in my case, I'm doing a research about the production of architectural knowledge in the Dutch East Indies in the early part of 20th century. So this kind of interest helped me to identify what kind of system of inquiry that I need. It means that what kind of question that I need to pose for this kind of research. So I always like these two diagrams that I always use from this book titled Architectural Research Method by David Wang and Linda Groth. And what I like from these two diagrams, because it's really explicitly describe the strategy of conducting a research from what you have as a system of inquiry, and then you need to have a school of thought, maybe in, well, what we call as a, let's say, literature review, and then the strategy and tactics of conducting a research. And the right diagram is about the what kind of question related to the type of research that we are going to conduct. So in my case, and I think in as a historical research, usually, and well, at least in my case, I would like to know actually is more on the methodological question as about why and how such events happen. Okay, I move to this one. So the system of inquiry usually lead to three, well, I think we all know here that there are three general logical questions that we can use for research: deduction, induction, and abduction. And in my research, I use induction because what I want to know is the operation and the why question. Why a thing happened in the past, and what is the, and we know also already the effect at the present, and what I want to know is actually in the events in between, the mechanism in between, why this cause and effect phenomenon occurred. So it reaches to this point that in order to find this operation, then we need to find evidence to construct the argumentation and to support the assumption. And in my case, I use archival investigation for my instrument to find this evidence. The problem with archival investigation is not because we cannot find what we want, but because there are abundant kind of information. And it can lead to something that may be unexpected. What I mean with unexpected is that sometimes you find some things that can alter everything. Maybe the direction, maybe the assumption, because you don't know that this kind of information exists. So for me, conducting archival investigation is also tricky, and it needs also a particular methodology to framing the facts, to framing the information. So I do in my practice conducting the research in archive center, I usually start with something that I call is framing the facts. So I will start with 3 criteria. Usually it's very generic. It's about the topic. That's the top one. And then the middle one is about the period, and then the place. I think based on the 3 criteria, I can contain some of the information in archive into something that is more related to my research. And about the media itself, I will start with information that broad, but this source of information published regularly. For instance, like newspapers and journals. why I think newspaper and journals is a good media to start with, because it provides you a map of information, of events and agents. So it's kind of doing a survey. And by this, actually, after this one, usually I have this a general map about information, and I can start to classify or prioritize which kind of information that I would like to further investigate. So from like this one is actually based on my own research. So after I did the first stage, actually the criteria expanding. So the topic becomes more specific, and the period somehow extended. And it is happened actually unexpected, because I didn't realize that in order to talk about the topic, like the production of architectural knowledge in the 20th century, that I also need to talk actually some years before that in order to create a cohesive argumentation about what happened. So this is only for me, I don't think I can think to extend my period of research if I didn't do the archival investigation. And also the place, the context of the place. Initially, I only wanted to research what happened in the Dutch East Indies, but then I realized I also need to do the research what happened in the Netherlands at the same period, because somehow what happened in the East Indies is kind of a dialogue between what happened in the metropole, the Netherlands, and the colonized country, the Dutch East Indies. So the next phase will be what I call with excavating the evidence, which what I did is looking for the first-hand sources. So if the first stage is looking for just newspapers, journals, but the second stage is trying to find the first-hand sources, first-hand accounts, such as journals, drawings, maybe project reports, or statistic, whatever that can really can provide illustration, information about what happened on particular events or figures that in that period, in that specific period and context. So as we can see, it also expanded. It always expanded. So now I found a lot of things that, well, for me is kind of new. So now it becomes, I found that there were a period called the ugly time period in the Dutch Netherlands. There's one particular period from 1835 to 1895, which actually the Dutch art historian usually forgot, and they do not want to talk about. But in 1995, the Rijksmuseum conducted this exhibition, which tried to construct a narrative of what happened in that lost period. And somehow this lost period is really related to what happened in Dutch East Indies, because this kind of style where in the Netherlands, they were kind of stopped after 1895, but then somehow it's kind of imported to the Dutch East Indies. So the way the style that is forgotten, but it is flourished in the Dutch East Indies in the 20th century. So it's something that is, this is something kind of information that you can find in archive. Okay. So I think I just moved the table of content then. The last part. Yeah, so as I mentioned in my first slide, that for me the methodology function in three ways. So the last function is, of course, about dissemination. It's about how we structure the research and how to make the research can be digestible, can be accessible to the audience. And I think it also needs some instrument to do that, because it's the nature of the information, or what we need to do that, is different. I mean, and in my case, I use the synchronic structure. It is based on structuralist theory. So I'm going to actually the order of my table of content based on the aspect is not chronological, so it's not chronological order, but it's based on the interrelated aspects that construct the narrative. So this is the table of content, at least at this stage, at my stage now. So there will be 4 chapters. So the first chapter will be talking about the background, the preset of the before the 20th century. Is about the late 19th century. Well, actually every chapter always start with the late 19th century, but the aspect that they focus is different. So the first one is more about the financial and social economy. The second one is about the engineering, the engineers. And the third chapter is about the rise of the training institution. And the last chapter is about a house, the layout of the house. I think that's all. Thank you.
I'm working at my 4th year actually this year, and I'm working on a PhD that hopefully will keep changing its name. You actually used the old title again, and I really wanted every year to come up with a different title in some sort of registry. Anyways, the first point I want to make is the fact that table of contents can work as a table or are just contents. And that says a lot for the way, at least in this very specific context, we're bringing together an X-ray of what this book that would eventually kind of end up in the library with our name, comma, PhD, will be. So trying to think of how to order the content that will become the table of contents, I could only think of Star Wars. And I need to tell you a 1-minute story about Star Wars in order to make my point. Growing up, I really didn't like Star Wars. I didn't understand the cult. I didn't understand the frenzy around it. And I think it had to do with the fact that I watched it in the wrong order. And I'm very serious. Like there is this website, and if you start kind of typing in Google saying what is the right order, immediately the next thing will come up is to watch the Star Wars movies. And there is this junction between the time that the first episode appeared and the order of the whole story, right? Like I guess you're familiar enough to understand what I'm trying to say. Here is a chart with when the episodes actually appeared. Like we start with episode 4, not even 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we go back to 1, 2, 3, and now we're at the point that again we go back to 7 and eventually 8, I guess. And in the right is the actual kind of internal chronological order. And I think in these 2 charts lays the whole argument of how things end up in a book or in a film. And the decision to start from the middle, this kind of in medias res that happens here, is basically what makes the story work. You could never start from the beginning, which was my mistake. I did the kind of the normal order, started with the newer stuff, the newer films, watching actors that I was more familiar with. So if you do kind of play the films in the right order, that of they actually appeared, you understand that there are clues and connections that they appear in order to link the stories in an internal chronology. And in that sequence, there is always something new that belongs both to the fact that there is a new film that came out with more information, but also more context that allows us to understand what was going on in the initial film, which was actually the middle film. And I think every book, whether it is a PhD dissertation or a novel has to work with that same system in order. So this is J.K. Rowling's Potter book overview, seven books in the making, and they're kind of all organized in this charter according to an internal chronology of the books. You see kind of October to April, but also like what kind of information appears on every chapter, on every book. And they're different systems. Obviously, this is Heller's outline for Catch-22, or Henry Miller's for Tropic of Capricorn. Faulkner actually kind of wrote the chapters on his walls and kind of arranged his body according to what he wanted to look at and work on every day. This is Miller's, which I kind of really, and if you blow it up and actually read it, it's extremely interesting. It's as if they're kind of many books in one. Like you can read the different stories without needing the context of what is around. But once you read them all together, it actually becomes that book. And of course, there is the perfect exception of these kinds of this kind of thinking, which is On the Road. It only has one chapter, and it has been written in one go with absolutely no structure. It's one story that cannot be broken down. There's no chapters, there's no paragraphs, actually. And I think it's there to actually reinforce the difference between that kind of thinking and working and this one. So being asked to produce one image of a table of contents, which doesn't exist, by the way, I can be very honest with you. I mean, I could make up one, but I think it's much more interesting to put on the table the content, which is what this is, the content as of right now on a table, and talk about it. Talk about what's on my table, on my desktop, or my actual desk. A less successful title than the original one, but I think right now it's more important to stick to it, is the trip and the party, architectural education at play. So what I'm looking at is architectural education, but I'm trying to dissect it in a way that allows me to generate an argument that says that teaching doesn't happen inside the curriculum. It happens wedged between trips and parties. This is where the actual learning happens, and the curriculum is a way to facilitate that kind of learning that we all do here. But the actual learning happens between marching elephants, fireworks, masquerade balls, excessive dancing, heavy drinking, road trips, etc., etc. I'm not going to go further into the argument. Just a couple more words about the category of the trip and the party being the same in my mind, being that exception from everyday student life. There's a whole term that leads up to the unit trip. There's a whole week that leads up to the Christmas party. And the power of this category of trips and parties that indeed, I would agree with what Maria just said, that brings us in contact with something much more real and raw than kind of the mediated architectural presence that a book allows, or even, you know, a studio environment allows. I was actually kind of surprised that I ended up on this group, because I thought I would be on kind of field work, but I do understand why I'm here. Because the whole point, like the whole research revolves around architectural education on the road, on the field, not outside the classroom, basically. And in a way, I operated like that as well. Like I took myself outside the library as much as I could, for obvious reasons. And I ended up kind of coming across these 4 amazing archives, and the constraint I gave myself was that there is a bigger project, there is a bigger argument, there's a bigger story to tell around the trips and the parties, but how I'm going to tell the story inside the book that is going to end up in the library with my name, PhD, will be focused only on the stories that I can tell through archival material that I will have come across during my research. And it's very liberating and very problematic in the same way, but I'm happy to have applied that constraint, especially because I think the 4 archives that I've been working with have been really studied, but also really slighted in the same time, and they're kind of dark corners around the shelves that really interesting things can come up. So last year, I visited Villa Medici in Rome, and they have this very interesting archive of, you know, the great projects. I'm not going to show them, but you know what I'm talking about, of the Beaux-Arts students coming to Rome and making these amazing drawings of temples, and then like as they further their education, they can actually work upon them and make them better, and you know what I'm talking about. And here it is, like this little folder in the corner that was not describing the output, the academic output that they were supposed to send back to Paris, but the actual life of the prize winners in Rome. And I'm only going to show you a couple of pictures. There are that many, and they're that amazingly interesting and beautiful in kind of their own right. And they are describing this life that I couldn't put together with the image that I had from, you know, Labrouste studying in Rome and being very serious while he's kind of making his argument about Paestum and which temple came first or which one came second. And there are all these stories that kind of come together with this archive that no one has touched. And I think not because they didn't find it, but because no one maybe agrees with me that this is of interest. And you kind of get to see, this is Tony Garnier with the big beard, the one who came up with came different back from Rome, like he came up with Cité Industrielle while he was there. And you get, there was a previous drawing before that they're kind of all awake and talking to each other, and there's this kind of like after the party, after the drinking, after the conversation, where they're all kind of sleeping collectively on this big table, in Villa Medici. So there's this operation that I'm attempting to compare and contrast the academic output with the actual everyday life of the student in Rome, and I'm doing it through this kind of archival window that allows me to look both at the work and at the life. There is a smaller and less interesting archive that has been probably exhausted in Paris, but does have the life of the students in Paris, the kind of not the best students who ended up in Rome, but the good enough students to have made it to that school, and describes the life of the atelier, describes the kind of crazy carnival masquerade balls. And again, like with a similar methodology, I'm kind of bringing together that aspect of architectural education with the actual output that we're very familiar with as far as the Beaux-Arts are concerned. The third archive that I'm working with is that of Konstantinos Doxiadis. He was this very well-connected Greek architect who ended up having a kind of a global presence during his time. But I'm really focusing on the Delo Symposium. It's this project that he attempted for 10 years actually in a row, inviting really, really important figures to Greece in order to take a collective holiday together. They would cruise around the islands, visit vernacular architecture, visit the antiquities, get extremely drunk, dress up, and talk about architecture. All that on a boat on the Aegean Sea during the summer. And he took this operation extremely seriously. This is one of the charts that you can find in the archive where he's actually kind of giving grades to the people he invited in the first year, saying this one was really good, like very talkative, we should invite them again. The other one didn't dance, maybe keep them as you know, at the end of the list next year. And you kind of get to see how serious he was about constructing that trip and party in order, in the end, to actually produce architectural knowledge through the conversations that he orchestrated amongst these kind of very important and famous historians or architects. This is, again, I always find it very entertaining. Like, there's this lists at the archives where you see which pictures people are visiting and which ones they're actually buying the rights from. So there's all these party pictures that everyone wants to look at. Like, you see everyone's name when they've registered just to look at that box, but they never take them out. Like, they're never published. And amongst the invited people in this very famous educational cruise was Buckminster Fuller. It's him on the picture there, and he was lucky enough that his birthday was always in that week of the traveling, and there's like 10 years of Buckminster Fuller's birthdays. One year he celebrated being dressed up as an ancient Greek. And it's the same day where in the morning he's visiting an ancient Greek temple, and at noon he's giving a lecture of 4 hours. He wouldn't shut up, but they would still invite him back. And in the evening, like he would kind of dress up as an ancient Greek and continue the conversation, if you will. The last archive that obviously it's kind of very close to home, and I fought not to get into, but here I am, is that of the AA, and there's, I think, so much wealth in trying to understand this institution and understand the pedagogical experiment that it represented through the lens of the festivities, the celebrations that took place here. Whether that is the spring abroad trips that were there just before the unit trip was implemented. There's this very famous trip in 1972-73 that year where the AA leased a plane and flew the whole diploma school to California. And this is a time where most of the people on the plane was the first time being on a plane, Peter Cook's first time being on a plane, and kind of unleashed the diploma school in California. Their stories about what happened there, which I'm going to talk about in a different time. But this kind of legendary carnival, this image that I think haunts me and haunts many people of the director of the school on the elephant, Pink Floyd playing at the AA. This is the publication that came out of that trip to California. There are lots of ghosts that need to kind of be addressed and kind of put the right perspective from this point of view in order to understand what actually happened and how actually that changed or didn't the mentality and the student culture of the AA at that time. So this is the content, basically, and it's sitting on my table. And it's waiting for an order for the story to be told. Last slide. This is, I visited Bernard Schumi trying to get some images from that legendary trip to California. He didn't have much, but he had these slides that he would kind of organize other slides with in order to turn them into categories. And there is one that's disjunction, obviously, and is red. There's another one that is city, but the one I think that is more relevant here is that of event. And I think in the end, the content will be organized in a table looking at the different agency all these events that I'm talking about had on the experiment that architectural education is. Thank you.
In a round table format. So I just brought two books, one of them being my thesis, that would just kind of be circulable. What button do I have to press? Sorry, cool. I suppose this is kind of okay. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, so I didn't bring a particularly or at all formalized presentation, unlike the two previous ones. I suppose I kind of make up for it by having the most formalized table of contents of them all, because I'm here in representation of like the experience of the recently completed PhD student. What I brought was two kind of, I'm not going to call them books because one of them is my thesis and it's not a book. Two kind of volumes. My thesis, which is called Architecture and Counter-Revolution, and then it has a really boring subtitle, The Ideology of the Historiography of the Soviet Avant-Garde. It's like one of the little things that I would like to change if I, like retrospectively, and just at least change the subtitle to The Western Invention of the Soviet Avant-Garde. It would kind of function better. Although I also think it sounds a little bit more trite, I don't know. And I brought another book called Western Marxism and the Soviet Union, which is a book that I found when my thesis was pretty much finished, like a couple of years ago. And my presentation will essentially consist of comparing these two tables of contents. These are two very similar researches at a lot of levels. My thesis is essentially a history of the historiography, Western historiography of Soviet architecture. So it's like a compendium of everything everybody has ever said about it in the architectural world, sort of. At least it tries to get close to that. Whereas this book is a history of the Western historiography of the Soviet Union. So like I'm compiling what Western architects have thought over time Soviet architecture was. This book is compiling what Western Marxists over time thought the Soviet Union was. So you can kind of see that obviously there is a kind of, but again, I just ran into this at one event at the SOAS a couple of years ago, and unfortunately, I couldn't take it into consideration in my thesis because by then I was in full output mode and I accepted no more input. These tables of contents are radically different. And I would put it in a way, the way I would say that, I would clarify this, I suppose would be to say that mine is a thesis and this one isn't. And this kind of dramatically changes the problem. The distinction is not really at the level of like, there's no architecture or even kind of cultural issues here, and mine is about architecture as a cultural issue, and actually, my thesis is explicitly about the significant distinction of writing a history, a kind of a cultural history, a history of culture and a history of like political economy, which is a kind of a central theoretical problem in the way, the framework with which kind of the left reads political issues, from what kind of the Marxist left to the kind of contemporary liberal left. But the distinction between the two theses is not at that level, the one that I'm bringing here. The distinction that is important is at the level of, let's say, I mean, and here I'm going to use two terms that Mark Cousins gave us in those kind of first year's PhD seminars I attended 4 or 5 years ago, in which he proposed that a thesis is kind of always dealing with the problem of articulating two different structures, what he called the logical structure and what he called the rhetorical structure. And the logical structure, both of these exist at the level of the argument. The argument has a logic to it, in which it organizes the content. But at the same time, there's a rhetorical dimension of it, the way in which the argument acts on the context, let's call it. In the final PhD presentations of last year, when I was presenting my finished thesis, Simos, at the end of the event, was asking us, the three of us who were presenting, about kind of the experience of writing, the experience of producing the thesis in general terms, after the presentation of all the content and etc. And I was kind of obstinately refusing to answer it in a way that would fit Sophia's research. I was like refusing to give the experience of the production of the thesis, as in giving Simos and the audience one picture of those that Sophia showed with me in it. What I was kind of trying to say as an answer to that question is the problem of precisely having, I mean, you have the problem of constructing an argument, but then you have the problem of making that argument fit the context in which it is produced as an act on what I call kind of the intellectual space of the polemic, which is really, in my opinion, the only space of production of a thesis that matters. It's not the repository or the field or the studio. These spaces are kind of, the difference between these spaces is entirely secondary to the fundamental problem of the space of the polemic. And I think that's kind of probably a conclusion we're going to arrive at the end of the session. At least I hope so, because I think I'm right. So the action of the thesis, of the argument in the context, forms the thesis itself. It's not really that you're changing your argument to adapt to the context so you can like sell it better. It's that, I mean, the metaphor I would use as a kind of a visual metaphor, because kind of architects like those, is the problem of like the projection of the object on the plane to produce a perspective, in which the plane of the projection is the context that is imposed on you. You don't get to choose the plane of the projection. But you do have your own object, which is, in this case, your argument in relation to the material. And you have, and you need to kind of find the place where you place yourself so that the projection on the plane that is imposed on you can be the kind of more operative, more interesting, more revealing projection. And this connects to the central problem, which I think is inherent in the production of what we call a thesis, which is kind of the move from the empirical relationship with the material with the theoretical relationship with the material. I usually kind of illustrate this. I always do it to all my students in history and theory. With a an example from the field, like the historical development of what we today call the science of biology, kind of scientific field of biology. The biology kind of begins through sort of taxonomy. You have several people, like the most well-known name of it is Linnaeus, who gave his own name to like a myriad of different species. That start looking at biological organisms and starts kind of observing them analytically in a physical way, and observing how they function, their structure, and kind of articulating them. And so you have, he ends up with a kind of a list that organizes like living beings with that structure. And you end up with things like, obviously, basic observable characteristics, like they live in the water, so they're fish. Fish are aquatic beings. And fish and aquatic beings is sort of a synonym, it's the same thing. But then later on, you have what I believe is the move to theory, from the empirical relationship to the theoretical relationship. And you have Darwin. And Darwin says, well, I actually have a theoretical kind of model that explains how these objects, these organisms kind of happen. They're not static, they're not just there. They relate to each other and they evolve over time, they change. And when you start constructing a model that explains how the thing is transformed, how the objects are transformed, the way in which you categorize them inherently changes because it matches the theoretical model that understands things that are different. It's not that Linnaeus was wrong objectively, but it's just that the empirical truth he was producing was much less useful and interesting than the theoretical truth that then Darwin can construct. And so whales aren't fish, they're mammals. The categorization in general changes and where things appear changes. And this becomes a central problem here. This table of contents is, as you can probably kind of see relatively simply, chapter 1, 2, one is introduction. Chapter 2, from 17 to 29, what Western Marxists think the Soviet Union is, and then it's divided like by trends of thought. Now we're going to go 29 to 41, and the same thing, 41 to 56. This is a repository, this book. It's a fantastic book. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's not a thesis. It does not produce a theoretical analysis of the object it's presenting. It's an amazing collection of data, but it's not what we call a thesis. My problem becomes the following. This bit here, this part 3, is essentially that. It's the same thing as that book had, but then there's the rest of it. And also, and I started with this. I produced like something like 3 or 4 tables of contents, 4 tables of contents over the duration of the PhD. This one, the final one, I kind of arrived at in the middle of the 3rd year, I think, like toward middle end of the 3rd year. By the beginning of the 4th, this was already clear. But I started with this. In fact, like the first bit I wrote of the thesis was roughly this. This was written in the end of the 2nd year. But then gradually, as I was researching the problem of like the Soviet avant-garde from the Western perspective, it became kind of immediately, it became kind of obvious, immediately evident that there was something missing, but not exactly what. By the end of the 2nd year, it was very clear that the category of the Soviet avant-garde exists within the general problem of the category of the avant-garde as a whole, and indeed the category of the avant-garde as a whole is predicated upon the Western history of the Soviet avant-garde. Like the two are interconnected. In fact, we had a seminar with, I don't remember her name. It was organized in the HCT master course by Marina, Greek researcher who teaches in China. And she was precisely tracing the use of the word avant-garde curiously, and that's kind of obvious coincidence with my problem. And she said that kind of explicitly. I noted down how often the word the avant-garde, which is a word that is effectively sort of invented in the 1960s, how often this term matches like the several objects that it's related to. And the Soviet avant-garde / Russian avant-garde was by far, she said, definitely the object that is most often referred to through the term avant-garde, precisely in this period, which is kind of nice. I wish I could have quoted her in my thesis, but she wasn't done yet. So as I realized that the two things are essentially connected, and that the ideological problems of the Western reading of that non-Western object became intrinsic to the category of the avant-garde in general terms, as we're dealing with it, the little thing that I used to think was going to happen, which was like the second half of the introduction, which was going to talk about the avant-garde as a whole, became the entire first half of the thesis. As I was writing the introduction became 90 pages long. No, actually no, 99 pages long. And it became the first half of the thesis. And it had to become that because the theoretical reading for me to be more like Darwin than like Linnaeus, I had to do that. I'm gonna finish here, that's fine.
Good afternoon to everyone. And can you hear me? Well? No. No? Okay. Now better. So thank you very much for being here. My name is Alvaro. I guess I would like to depart from an idea that Mark has pointed out, which is the idea of the table of content as something that somehow is the final product of the writing, in a way, as it can be read. And to move from that into, as Mark has said, to understand it as a tool, right? The only thing is, this is a software that I use the most, I guess. I'm in the last year of my PhD, and just to say a few words, you have said not to talk about content, but just to point that my research is about the desert, and particularly with journeys of artists and architects that have been in the desert. Okay, we will see. But as I was saying, Word is the tool that I use the most, in a way. And what you can see is one of the tools that you can insert is precisely a table of content. Okay, so it can be generated itself. And it's a way of saying, okay, that's it. That's really the table of content that I have, in a way. And you can see where I am, that I have written up to here, but then it changes and you see what is not written yet. So that for me is not really the table of contents, as you would suggest. And what I wanted to do in today's presentation is to review a bit how through these 3 years that I have done of my PhD, the idea of the table of content has been really a productive tool of reshaping basically the archival material that I was collecting. So, as opposed to Sophia was saying that she's not very comfortable with the idea of the archive, though she has done a lot. I'm feeling very much comfortable with the idea of the archive, and I think it's a field to reclaim somehow nowadays in the history of architecture, in a history really looking for first-hand sources and rigor, okay? So my first table of content deals precisely with that. So throughout my research, I have been visiting different archives and collecting, and very much with the idea that David was pointing out, to the idea of, and Maria was saying, the idea of mining. For me, in connection with the desert, it was very important, the idea of digging up, of kind of finding lost things among sand and dunes and things like that. So the archive was a realm in which to dig up things. But at the same time, I was very interested on the idea of the archive as a space that builds up. You have archives like La Perouse, this Spanish archive is in a castle. So I was interested in the idea of the archive as a space itself, and how it informs not only a way of cataloging, of maintaining, but also as a way of claiming something about the content of the stuff. So in a way, understanding it as a table of content in a way, in a special way. This is very clear in one of the archives that I was visiting. It's in Sir John Soane's museum. And one of the ideas that influenced my research visiting this archive was the idea of precisely the need of having a collection, of having an archive, of the importance of generating your own material, of collecting. Of course, this was relevant, and I started to collect of this material that I was not really sure if I was to use or not, but I was building up my own personal archive in a way. And the way of organizing it somehow comes influenced by Borges and this quote about the fictional, I guess, Chinese encyclopedia that plays with the idea of categorization. And as he says, in these remote pages, it is written that animals are divided into A, belonging to the emperor, B, embalmed, C, tame, D, sucking pigs, E, servants, etc., etc. Of course, this is also the departing point of Foucault, that in the prelude he's placed that the order of things departs from this joke in a way. But it's the idea that the catalog is never kind of objective and kind of unimportant, but really, in the way you organize the material, somehow puts forward an argument. I started up with generating like a database of organizing material in a very simple way about the author, the location, the year that I was doing. And I started relating by tags and also framing together different images, mostly. So in a way, I was interested in this idea of having a personal archive, but move beyond the banality of, yes, it's my personal collection and that's it, and try to generate like a source that could be shared by people, okay? It was also organized spatially in realms of the city that I was interested in, and historically. So that changed, that idea of having a digital contemporary version of an archive changed when I was visiting another archive, which is the Warburg Institute, on seeing the project for Warburg, that I guess more or less you know. If not, it's down the road and you're invited to visit it. But the idea is that he was generating this collection of reproductions of works of art throughout history, and he was arranging them in this kind of Borges way of relating things that are not a priori related. And what was interesting for me is precisely that space of the reading room in which he was displaying all these different constellations, I would call them, of different works of art put together, which in a way became his space of production. The way he was disseminating history of art, producing it, writing about it, or giving lectures was precisely in that space in which he was at the center in an elliptical plan, and he was able to see all history spread in a way. So in that way of having reproductions and starting them, arranging them in a very naive way, in a way, I started to work in this kind of board in which I was hanging reproductions. It is true that I was a bit low budget, but at the same time, this transformed my workspace, okay? So I put it in my room and I started pinning up and relating things. That was a key moment for me because rather than just collecting histories about the desert, I was starting to put limits to them, to start framing them and starting saying, okay, this is a constellation of, and I was generating different ones. But in a way, the idea of collecting was very much framed by the physicality of the board. So for me, to move from the digital into the physical collection was really relevant. Also, I said the thing of I was moving in low budget because by the time I was not able to visit the desert, okay, and that has been a question, wow, okay, so I have to speed up. But I started producing all the material that I had in a collection of postcards. Well, that were relating the different materials, okay, with this idea that, okay, I was not able to visit the desert, but these guys were, and somehow we were in correspondence. And these are the constellations, so this idea of not being able to visit the desert was also very relevant for me because I was very much focusing visiting archives and seeing through their eyes, seeing the material that they were producing. So these constellations were playing with the idea of Borges, so it's like having a bit surreal sort of feeling to the rigorous categorization. And I moved to the idea of the technology of vision that they was using. How I was seeing the desert, I was through the technologies of vision on these different people that I was visiting. So one is on the Cyclops, another was on the Icarus. This is not yet a table of content, but it was the way that framed most of my thesis. I'm gonna move into this very quickly. The second element, which was an object that I found in an archive, which is this sun compass that Ralph Wagnall, which was a geologist that was working in the border between Egypt and Libya, was using to navigate the desert. So in the desert, I don't know if you know, well, there was a shift in which you start using cars, and because of the cars, you cannot use the magnetic compass because it was affected by the metals of the cars, basically. So he invented this solar compass that was put in front of his car, and he was able to navigate using the sun, okay, because the sun is changing with the azimuth, and he was able to recalibrate constantly by this object, okay, the sun compass. And what was interesting was he was producing a series of maps of the desert in which the complexity of the geography is traced basically by the itinerary he was doing with smooth spine-lines, okay? So it was important for me to somehow embed the idea of navigating through the desert was the way I was journeying somehow. So the way I communicate that is that this was my first table of content, in a way, which was to organize the complexity of the material that I was having by setting up a map in which there were very clear constraints, which was, it was to start in Paris, move into Egypt, and then navigate westwards through the north of Africa, up to go back into Egypt, into Paris, sorry. That has to do more with the argument of the thesis, but somehow this circularity was helping me to organize the material. Then, so it's one of these fragments of maps, these actual maps that these guys were producing on the areas that they were visiting. And I started also organizing in accordance to another criteria, which is the technology of vision, the means of transport, and different ways of organizing. I'm gonna move on because I'm super behind, but the idea is that finally I ended up with producing a super grid of content in a way. That was the previous step to starting writing. So this came from visiting the archive of Raymond Roussel, which the surrealists somehow claim him as his father. And behind these super weird stories he was writing, he had like a super clear mathematical order which he produced his books. And I wanted to apply that logic of having like a very clear rigidity and at the same time a sort of madness about it, okay? So the way this works is on the left you have the different chapters, okay? I have 12 chapters, and they are gathered around clusters with one specific topic. So where you see the red line the red line, sorry, is the end of one cluster that talks about the limits of identity. The second cluster is about the limits of vision, the limits of knowledge, and then on hybridity at the end. And on the upper part, you have the different constraints that I was putting myself. So it was to start in 1848 and just look at 100 years, so, and move chronologically as well as geographically. And each of them I was to have a main character, the type of character that it was, secondary character, a main book, secondary. So I was setting up this series of constraints that I needed to have, and that I still working with. So this basically I carry with me in my bag, and I open it up every time. Sorry, and I work on it. So it's like my table of contents and my table of work. And when I set up on writing one chapter, I look at this in relation to all the others. And yeah, and it integrates. Well, I would say that's it. Sorry for the delay.
Momentum, we'll call it. The organizers have asked that we keep our conclusions, and I'll invite the session chairs back to the table at the very end. But to press on and introduce session 2, with Ricardo giving a few words in front of presentations by Andrea, Mohammed, and Hyun-Jae. At that point, we will take a break after those 3 students. This last session is the only one with 4 students. We'll take a coffee break and come back for the last session, after which we will be able to take stock of all 3 sessions. Ricardo.
Okay, let's do it. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ricardo de Hostos. I will try to be short. I'll try to be on time, so I'm going to time myself here. As some of you know, I'm a teacher at intermediate school for the last many years, right, Maria? But I'm also run a studio down the road called Nine de Hostos with my partner, Annette Jakovsky. And I was very interested and, of course, intrigued to be part of this conversation because just the title interests me so much. The title about field research is something that I tend to study, and I start my career, in fact, with a project that was a bit of a middle finger to traditional contextual understandings of we need to go to a site to understand the place. The idea of the Hanging Cemetery of Baghdad, this project that we did in from 2004 to 2006, was exactly trying to see our own relationship to the context of Iraq, that we were not there, we're not from there, we don't have family there, but although we were going for protests and manifestations, and the idea with that was, how can we actually discuss a context that is part of TV news, that is part of the mediatic, that we're constantly exposed to it? So the project itself is observed by 6 CCTV cameras. So my start into context, and a lot of people tend to think I'm very interested in context, was exactly not doing the traditional context. So the idea of field work, perhaps, I'll try to perhaps introduce the discussion for us to throw a few interesting questions about the distortion of context, the distortion of field, and to how can we create a center of gravity that we can maneuver with a certain independence. So my field of reference primarily is literature, and is fiction, and is mythology. So I'm fascinated by writers like Salman Rushdie or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which are able to tell a whole cosmology about Colombia or British Indian, and also create a sense of imagery, a sense of non-literal verbose configuration of what the context they are trying to describe or the field work that is trying to describe. So these are some of the books we published. The first one, the latest one called The Scavengers and Other Creatures in Promised Lands, And this is the table of content. This second book here, called Ambiguous Space, we told the editor in America of Princeton Press that the title was Birth Giver. And they said, no, this is not an architectural title. You gotta give something else. So we end up becoming Ambiguous Space, which somehow describe and doesn't describe. So it feels a bit alien on our career so far. But I really like this idea currently that to think about ideas of context and ideas of how we operate in some contexts with gravity. So a lot of the titles, a lot of those words might sound quite eccentric to some of you, like landworms, phantoms, Morpheo builders, scavengers, or even the word creature. But as the authors that I mentioned before, the table of content and the organization of research for us is really about how the sympathy of words also creating its own constellation. By naming something, by giving a shape, by giving a form somehow, you also attract and repulse other assimilations. So the idea of naming, the idea of analyzing context with this kind of contemporary digital noise is very much part of our endeavor. Something as well that, like for example, books like American Gods do very well is exactly to think about when you migrate, when you bring your context, when you go to another context, do you also bring your context with you? That's what this book, which is now actually Amazon series on Amazon, talks about. It talks about when you bring your context, when you come as a migrant, you also bring the gods, and you also bring the traditions and rituals, and what happens to them when they do not have the value or the circular cosmology that happens in traditional communities. So we travel, we take the students, particularly Inter 3, to many places that tends to see not their comfort zone. So for example, Varanasi in India, where they have a sacred river. Along the same river, if you take a long section of this river, you see on the top people defecating, urinating. Down the river, 5 meters down, you see people washing clothes. And down the river, even lower, you see the sacred cremation of bodies and the deposit of these bodies on the river. And while you might think that most of the people are ignorant by not doing something about that, in fact, they know very well what they're doing. Some of the people having a bath every day in this place and knowing that the water is very polluted, they are the ones that are doing PhDs at universities of water filtration there. So I'm fascinated by what's the cognitive mechanism that enables us to turn off and turn on certain intelligence. There is a decision-making there that they bring the context of the sacred above the context of scientific rationality. So we visit to a lot of these places, we travel to some of these contexts, and part of this conversation is about engaging with different characters. How can we, instead of the field work perhaps being a concentration of factual reasoning, which is always necessary, objectivity is necessary in some point of the research for us. I'm fascinated by also this calling automatically here, this kind of encryption within the sites. Like this temple around this quarry, which was all mined, but the only thing left was this Ganesha temple. Is one of the temples of worship. You might call it power control for the workers or simply a respect. And we work with a way that by giving names, by creating imagination, or by selecting images, and they can assimilate some of these talks like seasonal village or suspended village, that this can inform projects which, as we call, with chromatic strategies. Like in jazz, when you have an outer note outside the scale, you bring something else because of the composition. So some of these compositions we generate and are generated from photos, from drawings, but also from artifacts, like these artifacts from Peru, which actually is an architectural model. The architectural model is the field work. The Incas used to take this out of their house. It was a little like an environmental device. They took this every day that they left their house with this. One is a wind blower and another one is a water capsule. So they used to take their house with them every day. which was part of the cosmology. Or the Negura canvas, which is also, that was used for land ownership, I think also, as is going to be discussed soon. When they lost their land, this canvas was utilized to prove that the desert was not invisible or unoccupied. This was to prove in court that those guys could earn, 8 minutes, could earn a vast tract of land. So suddenly a document is created out of mythology, out of tradition, out of this context, and is transverse the reality into another context where it has a friction, it has a validity to it. So I'm very interested about this conversation that we can have with lack of a better word, some kind of a proto-mythological spaces, and at the same time digital spaces where some of these decisions are made. So we make drawings, and some of these drawings try to create, bring those contradictions. They have different scales, they have different times, are not drawn on the same plane, similar to that little Peruvian house. And they also don't only talk about perhaps what is written on the books that describe the place. Some other outputs, talking about the table of content as organization of the research. The output here also organized research. This was an installation we did with the students at the Embassy of Brazil two and a half years ago, or 2 years ago. And it's a map of Rio de Janeiro. The idea of when you go somewhere and you have partnerships with anthropologists, with people which are dealing with land, with different aspects of land, from anthropology to social workers, to actually policies, you find an incredible amount of stories that is hard to bring to the debate to justify people using a land. So part of the output of going to field work, I think, is about trying to encrypt and trying to create an output which organize the complexity which is not spoken yet. So I think my interpretation of field work is, of course, we strive for clarity, but I'm very interested on from drawings to diagrams like this one and artifacts as a way that we can perhaps not run so quick on the research of what is field work. And amazingly enough, some of those conditions are brought back into sites like this, sites where the coast is moving 3 kilometers a year. So how do we deal with that? Of course, we need data. We need to measure those data, and that data, I cannot do it. I don't have that expertise. I need that data coming from satellite, from the Bangladesh stations, and the USA stations. They are reading this coast that moves 3 kilometers a year due to global warming. So I'm very interested on I wrote here a few questions, and just to maybe spice up our discussion at the end. So how can you identify or present what is not easily quantifiable or is not yet on the protocol of architectural research? How can comparisons and case studies be cross-referenced, for example, pre-industrial land ownership patterns? And could some of those cultural elements enable conversations between spatial traditions, land usage, and contemporary issues? And the last one, is fieldwork purely on the side of local contextual elements, or projective areas of digital know-hows and practices bring different ideas to the field? These are just some questions, and I don't know if I understand all the questions myself, but I'm very, very interested in what they have to say in terms of establishing this organization of thought. So perhaps different from many people here, I work with imaginative and not fully explained ideas, and I think that gives a great leverage for exploring the unknown. But now we're gonna see three amazing students with Andrea, Mohammed, and Jay. So let's see also what they have to say. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm on my 3rd year. There was a struggle coming up with the table of contents. Just beginning of this week, I told Lucas that I was going to pull out. I feel like I'm constantly in the cusp of changing the table of contents. There's this constant movement of going in and out, focusing magnifying, going into each chapter, and then pulling out, and then realizing that what I just wrote has nothing to do with what my table of contents was. It's this constant going in, zooming out, zooming in, and realizing that I might have wasted probably 2 years of my PhD just going in and out and not being sure what this is about. So for now, at least, what it is about. I'm writing about Singapore and how with national development and coupled with the limitation of the amount of space that we have, there's conflicts of interest. And because of that, there are a lot of policies that are introduced, like the 99-year leasehold properties. There's also the Land Acquisitions Act, where the government can acquire your land at any time, even though it's a privately owned land. And the 1998 burial policy, which means that burials can only last for 15 years. And the cemetery exhumation exercises, which has cleared cemeteries in Singapore. And all these challenge the concepts of home and land ownership. By discussing these policies, the thesis aims to reflect on spatial technologies to tackle land scarcity, but these policies are not only used as pragmatic ways to solve the problem of land scarcity, but it's also a reflection of the state's power and authority over the ground. And as a young nation, Singapore is about 53 years old. It is multicultural, and here comes a bigger struggle, is to forge a national identity and inculcate a sense of belonging and rootedness too. The word rootedness alone has something to do with the ground, but yet at the same time, the irony comes when the government is removing the ancestral remains from the ground, and the ground and the earth is constantly shifting and constantly moving. So the thesis opens up the discussion on such difficulties and ironies, and the state's strategy to try to decipher what an authentic national identity is. So this is the cityscape of Singapore and the public housing, which about 87% at the moment of population is in these public housing. And these are the old burial sites. This image was taken from a film that was made called Moving House. It was trying to say that in Singapore, there's no such thing as a final resting place. And there's no such, so in this particular film, this grave was being exhumed. And this was at like 5 in the morning at dawn. And they were going to excavate the cemetery. So the table of contents. Firstly, this image is a cone. The Latin phrase at the bottom means that if the owner of land owns the land from the center of the earth to the heavens. So I just imagine the ground as a huge cone. We always imagine ground as something, a plane or, but in Singapore especially, this phrase actually doesn't apply because when you own a piece of land, you only own 30 meters underground and whatever the height allows you to build up to. So I start off by looking at what national identity means, and especially post-colonial identity. Singapore is made up of Chinese, Malay, Indians, and others. And this segregation actually in itself is not multiracial and not multicultural. And then I look at homes for the living. So I look at why public housing system here is necessary and how by using some policies, home and rootedness to place is the same thing. I look at the relationship of the ground and its and national identity as well, and how Singaporeans are never living very close to the ground. They're always 40 stories, 30 stories above the ground. And even that, the public housing flats are designed to not even have a ground story. So there's no one actually living on the ground. And then in the next chapter, I talk more about homes for the dead. And I talk about how cemeteries were being cleared and all the bodies exhumed. And in a recent case, actually, when bodies were exhumed, new houses were being built. And a lot of Asian cultures, and I'm sure many cultures around the world, are very superstitious, and this would probably not go well with many people living in an ex-cemetery. But for some reason, there is this public amnesia, or there is this new tradition where it's okay to live on cemeteries. And in fact, the demand for those flats that are built there are actually really, really high, driving the cost of public housing to about £400,000 per flat. So this is public housing flats. And even that demand is very, very high. And I look at how, because of this, how to deal with death, the government has also built two large crematoriums, which are the main crematoriums in Singapore. And the architecture of these crematoriums actually show a stripping away of traditions and cultures. If there's so many cultures that were in Singapore, the architecture actually has this ambiguous, plain architecture that tries not to have any symbolisms of any religion and is not biased to anything. So I look at it as a stripping away of tradition and coming up with a new national identity of pragmatism. And so I look at the new traditions and the Singapore identity and the relationship of ground to national identity. And I like to play with metaphors, so my titles are like the post-mortem. And the final part of my thesis, I know, I laugh at my own thesis, the ground rules, and I talk about the sense of self, and I really discover psychologically, what's the personal identity and how it's tied to national identity and how that is in relationship to the ground. So yeah, so what I hope to do is to put alongside Homes for the Living, if you can't tell, it's on this side, and then Homes for the Dead on the other side, which strangely looks similar to me. So yeah, that's my thesis, and that's my table of contents for now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mohammed. I submit in a week, so I'm in a very weird place right now. I'm actually kind of, well, actually, the table of contents I'm presenting today differs from the table of contents that is in this booklet, which I submitted a week ago. So,
please abstain from making suggestions.
Yes, exactly, please. So I have kind of a bit of hindsight in which I made this presentation after I've structured almost everything, I think. And so my introduction is kind of just the basic introduction where we have the research methods and research questions and so on and so forth. But ever since I can remember, I remember the first slide I had when I started the PhD here, which was I had these three domains. It was biology, computation, and urban design. And for the past 4 years, my entire thesis has revolved around these three domains. And what it does involve is an exhaustive kind of literature understanding of the current state of the art of specific subfields within these three domains. I'm not much interested in all of biology or all of the computation or all of urban design. I'm more interested in evolution specifically, evolutionary computation, and urban variation. More importantly, though, even those three subfields are quite extensive. And so between them, I've kind of highlighted specific disciplines that I find most interesting and that have contributed the most to my research. And what I really like about these kind of subdisciplines is that they're not all related to one another, and that has pushed my research into different areas that I feel I didn't really expect beforehand when I started. And essentially, when I started my research, it was all about urban design. But then later on, I really kind of jumped into evolution and started taking courses in the Natural History Museum of New York on evolution and evolution for educators. And then I started taking courses on computation, and now I'm kind of finding myself between this computation section that I can't really get out of. And so this is one of the most difficult chapters, not because it was difficult to do, but because it was difficult to situate, chapter 3. Mainly because it came about from about my second year until today, where I continuously develop these analytical tools to which I can evaluate the application of evolutionary computation in urban design. And this is a section that I've moved around my thesis. I'm not really sure if it's going to stay here, to be honest. I'll find out in a week. So I'm quite kind of, straightforward with how I conducted my research. It revolves around several experiments. And so the first sets of experiments revolved around the application of evolutionary computation, and specifically within that, the application of evolutionary computation for single objective problems or multi-objective problems. So essentially just design problems comprised from a single objective or multiple objectives. and the comparison between these two. And all of the experiments I've conducted are set or utilizing a urban superblock in different regions or countries. And of course, the comparison between these two and the methods of which I've started to develop into how do you set up a design problem, something that is constantly overlooked when applying evolutionary computation in design. The design problem and the regulation between fitness objectives or design objectives, gene pools or variables, and the body part or the actual geometry that is being evolved. And so this is when I started, this is kind of the first steps of where I started to develop the analytical tools and the statistical analysis, and this is kind of one of the first times this was applied as a generative process and not just an analytic process. So the whole point of these tools was to learn from the experiments and use them as a feedback mechanism to further drive the second set of experiments, which is kind of the second stage of this chapter, into which I've learned from those first, and then, so the first chapter was creating population sizes of about 400 solutions. This chapter started to increase that population size to thousands of solutions. And then this is where I started to integrate kind of the statistical analysis as a feedback mechanism into how I can correlate each individual that's being evolved to how it looks, to its position within the objective space, which is kind of that graph there. So this kind of, this first chapter really built up my my comfort zone, so to speak. I became very comfortable with these tools. I became very comfortable with, specifying or generating the design problem. And now I wanted to test these tools and the methods that I've developed into two different scenarios. One, which is application of them for the development of a superblock in a planned city, and two distinct extreme biomes. One, which is a city in Russia, in Norilsk, kind of one of the most populated Arctic cities. And this is where kind of, I started to really understand the impact of these tools in generating variation using the same superblock that was being used to design. And so the whole point here is how can we start to tackle the same fitness objectives better through more variation within different blocks and superblocks within the same urban tissue. And so to test this in a kind of opposite biome, I went into testing this concept into evolving a set of superblocks for an evolved urban tissue, which is the city of Fez El Baleh in Morocco. And how can we kind of also, through different objectives that are specific to that specific site, how can we work with those and generate also urban variation for that? Finally, this is where kind of I started to go into the computational part of things, and I just kind of, just went into this kind of vortex that I couldn't really drag myself out. And this is where also I started to work with my colleagues, especially Milad, where, he started and his enthusiasm started, pushing me towards directions that I didn't really know I was capable of. And so here I started to understand, well, all these kind of experiments looked into generating urban variation through an exhaustive analysis of the results generated by the application of evolutionary computation. So there's this, create a design problem, run this algorithm, analyze the results, and feed it back into reconstructing the design problem to generate better results with more variation that are better fit to the fitness objectives. But then I started looking into ways where I can incorporate the analytical part of things within the algorithm, so that the algorithm and the design problem is being updated according to the analytic results being generated live and dynamically within every generation. And so to test this, I tested this on both, again, going back to my first experiments, single objective and multi-objective problems, where I was able to control how much variation I'm generating within the algorithm without having to do or conduct the analysis parts outside of the entire kind of simulation. So everything was done internally. And then also, applying this on a multi-objective design problem. This becomes enormously difficult to do, but I'm very happy that I was able to do it. Mainly the problems are a little bit simplistic now, so this is where I started to stray into kind of the computational part of things, less of the urban side of things. But as a proof of concept, it works, and it's been kind of accepted within the larger scientific community. Thank you.
All right, I'm Hyun-Jae now, and I want to introduce how I organize the structure of my research and develop the design experiment. So this research explores the field of intelligence and consequently find and use its applicable techniques to program an architecture system. The system is to be capable of understanding real-time data and controlling spatial configuration. Moreover, this research discussed the design methods for urban open space, which deal with the issue of the emerging public sphere in the digital space and the decline of the public life in open space. Currently, community formation has been transformed from being place-based to being media-based due to the advancement of communication technologies. Regarding this issue, the design of programmable space suggests a placemaking strategy to encourage community engagement and to promote cultural development of the city. So there are three main domains to be investigated. The study of intelligence includes the application of artificial intelligence. The design study of adaptive architecture develops tiny changeable structures. And the study of urban open space focuses on spatial data analysis. This research explores the relevant studies of intelligence. There is a gap between the emerging knowledge on intelligence and its technical application to architecture practice. This research attempts to find the gap and apply different techniques to design an architecture model. In the architecture field, the practice of architectural adaptation have been investigated to extend the ability of architecture to be more closely responsive to users' activities. For urban development, the term smart city has been used to describe the information and communication technology that can deal with urban data to monitor real-time happenings in cities. In the field of AI, data processing techniques have been developed to create a thinking machine that can perform a cognitive function akin to human way of thinking, such as learning or understanding. So after exploring the field, the 4 techniques are selected to carry out the design experiment. So based on the 4 categories, references are collected and reviewed for the design development. And the design experiment attempts to set an architecture system to map the flow from input of data to output of spatial condition. So based on the current knowledge of intelligence, the design experiment develops a computational model to suggest a placemaking strategy for social space in urban open space. So this is my table of contents. So that the way the structure was applied to this table of contents. So the chapter 2 and 3 is mainly about the literature review, and the rest of the chapters describe the design experiments. So the chapter 2 includes the field of intelligence and describe how the term intelligence is defined to develop data processing techniques. The chapter 3 is about how urban open space have been organized through the history and how the meaning of the space has been changed. And chapter 4 describes useful techniques and algorithms to develop an intelligent system. And chapter 5 is about the analysis of open urban space and the design experiment of architecture system. The chapter 6 is the test and simulation of intelligence architecture. So my research question, the primary research question was whether an architecture system could adapt or adjust its spatial configuration to the time-based change social activities. And the secondary question was whether artificial intelligence technique could use to program a controlling system for architectural adaptation. So open public space in Manhattan Island were selected to be the site to simulate the architectural model. And I would like to show how the design experiment was developed by the presented structure of the research. So investigating one of the NYC open data, which is called NYC permitted event, a data visualization technique was applied to observe social activities in open space in New York City. So the data visualization shows the location of social activities in NYC open space. And the data over the past months was collected to observe the frequency of activities. So as you see, you can see the different frequency of activities in different seasons. And as a result of analysis, there were 5 open spaces holding high frequency of events. So one of the NIC open space holding high frequency of events, the Bryan Park, was selected to simulate an architectural model. There is like a animation, but it's not working. Okay. So the design experiments also, oh, it's not missing. So the design experiments I did was like something skin can like transform and can transform by the frame moving, but the video is not showing it. And also I did the real-time, the simulation based on the algorithm that the algorithm connect to the internet, the data, and then it just automatically perform the transformable structure. So this was the algorithm that I made. So unfortunately, I cannot see the video, which is it's quite sad, but yeah. So for the development, is like basically the real-time simulation was achieved, and then it based on it closed and opened, and it opened the skins based on the 2 data sets. And after that, I was thinking about the decision-making process that with the more detailed information of the context of events and also the weather patterns. So it's not just gonna be open and closed, but based on different condition of context of event and different condition of weather, it will like behave differently. All right, thank you.
We'll end on that sad note before our, it isn't so sad. We got the picture, don't you worry. Session 3 looks at studio-based research. And the session is chaired by my dear colleague, Monia DeMarchi, who will be talking with Naina, Arturo, and Milad. When that session concludes, I will gather the 3 chairs of each, the chair of each session, 3 of them, round the table for some conclusions and hopefully some fortune-telling of the future. So off we go. I wanted to give Monia a chance to address the room. Thank you, Monia.
Okay, I've been asked to chair this section, and we're going to have then Naina, Arturo, and Milad giving the presentation on studio-based research. Very, very briefly, just so you know, I've been first studying in DRL, so a studio-based environment. I've been teaching intermediate and diploma for a few years, and in the last 7 years running the first-year studio, which again is a studio-based, not only because we have this year 100 students, but I also work with a team of 12 talented teachers. So it is an investigation that we always have as a team base. I'm not going to show first-year work or the work that I've been doing with the students, with the tutor. Instead, I thought that maybe we can put forward some, maybe question or a way of approaching research. Then I'm not saying that they are, let's say, unique or particular. I think they're just, as I said, like other way of how we might can approach research, and that's the way that we've been working. So as I said, for me, the focus of a studio-based research and the point that we can use is that it is a malleable environment where research can happen with different agency and expertise that can be actively engaged. So we can work outside the realm of architecture, and we can work outside the realm of the school. The reason is simple, because if we put as a question, how do we inquire, investigate, and explore and test a topic in which the level of complexity require a collaborative approach? How can we do it? And I here put forward like 4 things that maybe could be investigated. 1, who is actually the author of the research? Maybe we can allow the openness of having multiple authors. So getting expertise as an active member, as an author of a specific research, instead of having or expecting that one single author is actually the making on a specific project. So the author at the end, maybe of your research, might be a team instead of a singular individual. I don't know if it applies for PhD, but I think there are a way of how we can approach a project. Then how does the process of inquiry actually take place? We can embrace and encouraging a physical extension where research takes place, again, I said, outside the school, but extend towards different fields, in order to explore how different point of view on the same topic can actually challenge us. This is not in order to see the application of our own research, but to see actually what other fields have to say. Then location, where actually is work, research output taking place? We talk about studio, field work, etc. These places could be run in parallel. So when actually we use the word experiment, test, exploration, we don't really mean that we are doing simulation, but we really mean that we're doing actualization. So these things have been happening, and we have some sort of feedback. So in that sense, the work has to take place outside the studio and not only for a brief time, maybe 2 years outside the EA. Then last one is what one of the students before David, when he was talking about dissemination, I call it the aftermatch. Who is actually interested on the research we're putting forward? Who is the audience or the client, or what are the possible applications? So instead, when you are done, instead of reaching out, pay attention to who is actually reaching in. Pay attention to who is interested on your own research, and it might be unexpected to see where actually the application might be. Pay attention to the urgency that go beyond sharing knowledge, but is much more about how your research is an active tool that enables physical change. And that's it. And now I'm going to let Naira, Arturo, and Milad to present their work.
Okay. Hello, my name is Nena. My research right now is called Becoming International, Being Modern. I have changed the title, I have changed the content, and the table of contents far more than I would like to mention. In fact, the ones I'm going to show you now, I haven't yet decided on one. I have actually 2 options that I'm putting out here. I was supposed to do 3, but I stopped at 2. It took all my time. Just to say that the reason I am part of the studio-based research group today is I believe my work is not a single author. I mean, I will get the credit for it, but I would think that my supervisors are equally important, but also the students I work with. I work only in the PhD studio every single day. I'm in the school. In fact, this particular drawing was because Lucas misunderstood something. I sent him a key image and he thought it was my table of content image. And then he printed it. So I had to then change my table of content image and kind of rethink the whole thing. So I think that is where it becomes very interesting for me to actually see the misunderstandings, or when I talk to my colleagues about certain things, how they completely misunderstand what I say, and it actually becomes useful to me. So I'm going to start with the first version of it. This is one option, which basically talks about my research as a system. It's about the idea of defining the international through 4 terms in this particular version. And as you can see, all the 4 terms are interlinked, and they actually drive the international forward. Now, to be able to understand, I'm not going to read through this, and I can't. I don't even have my, but to understand this, I've had to actually understand every single chapter or summarize it for now, because I would not have been able to make a table of content if I didn't understand what I was putting into it. For me, that was very important, and this was also a way to test my argument. So when something did not work with the argument, I went back and changed the content a little bit, or I changed my argument. This is version 2, which is very different from version 1, and I'll explain. I'm going to actually show you why what are the differences between the 2. Now, this particular version of the table of contents actually shows the research organized as 6 separate chapters, which actually each chapter is singular. They exist by themselves. And they address the same issues, but from a very different point of view. The argument remains the same, but there's nuances in the way that the position is articulated. And if you look at this, and over here as well, I've had to actually list out every single chapter and understand what the content is and how it can be tested against the abstract. And that's why the whole thing is on one single piece of paper. Now, the real differences actually are quite interesting because I never thought of it till I didn't actually do the presentation. So as I told you in the first case, which is on the diagram on the left, the chapters are interlinked. So it's actually a process of sequence. So one chapter leads into another, and the third and the fourth, and the argument actually develops through this process that connects them. And then there's a final argument, which becomes like almost a field or a case study, which then I test all the different parts of the thesis against. The second one is actually every single chapter is singular, right? They exist by themselves, which means that the second version would be easier to publish, would be better for lectures, which would possibly, I would be able to handle it better also as an object. I also found that in the first diagram, when I was trying to articulate some of the terms, I really struggled. And it also gave me a clue on the fact that maybe some of them were too big. They were too impossible to handle within one chapter, which made me then question its validity in the time span, or maybe that one chapter was the whole research and I was not willing for that yet. That's one of some differences. Then they both will involve archival research. They will also have library research. They will have fieldwork. I will use a lot of drawings and text, not only as material, but I will actually make drawings of various books that I read, and I'll show some of the examples a little bit later. And then, so I've explained that to you, and then I've said, okay, now what I do is when I name the chapters, for me that's very important. So all the names of the chapters actually are so that I do not forget the point of the chapter. So right now, the name is actually constructed, so I understand what the argument of the chapter is supposed to be. Because otherwise, I think I could, so for me, the title becomes very important to ensure that I keep consistent. And then the next thing is, I told you about the position being the same, but slightly nuanced. And I also created what I call an image of content, an image of intent for my thesis, which is basically I didn't want to forget what the larger aim was. And it's the idea of defining the international as, it's the idea of defining the international, but also showing it as a mechanism of oppression in certain cases. And that is the kind of position or argument that I'd like to take. And I thought this was a very important image. On the left, you actually have Minit De Silva, who is a graduate of the Architectural Association. She's a Sri Lankan architect, very unknown. She studied here, quite unknown, and I thought it was very interesting that she's actually in 1956 walking up a bamboo ladder to inspect concrete, wearing a sari, and all the while, modern architects are talking about denationalizing dress and removing the ideas of femininity in modern architecture, to actually make the woman equal in a way. And I thought that was a very interesting idea to kind of juxtapose, only because that is the central argument of my thesis, that when modern architecture has or the international has been propelled forward, it has always done so at the cost of a lot of other cultures and religious practices across the world. And this for me was the way that I remember that basic idea. I work in many ways. I write everything down. I have a notebook and I actually write every single quote and reference, and everything is written down, and then I scan it. I also have a blog, and what this forces me to do is summarize my readings or summarize some certain comments and put them up and make sure that it's well written. It also becomes an exercise for myself, but it also becomes something that I share with people. In addition, I do drawings. So when I read a book, this is from Kafka's The Trial, I actually draw out the spaces or the structure of the book, which also then helps me to navigate through the information. So there's like these layers of there are many ways that I work to be able to kind of construct this thesis. It's arduous, it takes a lot more time, but it's the way I work. So I spend possibly double or triple the amount of time to do one particular book than maybe if I just read it really quickly, but it's part of the whole experience. And in addition, in terms of talking about how to kind of forward a research, I just spoke to Ed at the archives today, and we talked a lot about this particular image. And he doesn't have her archives material in the school, but there is a lot around the magazine that she worked around. So that becomes another sort of investigation, which might be connected to my PhD directly, but it is something that I can take forward in many different ways in many different forums. That's about it. Thank you.
Wow, that was tough, because my PhD is pretty much about the opposite. It's about unstructured, and it is not so much based on documentation as some of the presentations we've seen, but it's based on a series of material manipulation exercises that eventually led to conclusions or theoretical arguments about the relationship between the everyday use of plastic and certain process within urbanization. This is a PhD by design. The title is Plastic. The subtitle is very small because I might change it. I almost finished. The use of everyday materials as a design tool towards the material as alternative material perspective on the process of urbanization. So what I thought on doing is organizing the table of content for this presentation chronologically. Since it's a design-based PhD, which started with a lot of exercises and sketches, the first thing I did is actually the appendix, which is a portfolio, a huge library of iterations, material manipulations that eventually led to the first installation. This, sorry, has to be said, the research is based on three major one-to-one installations, which are these three public events. The first one was done in 2000, Snubepet was done in 2012. The second one was in Bagnet, was done in 2014, and the third one was done in 2016. So I started my PhD in 2011. I'm going to flip to the images in a very chaotic way, which makes my point, I guess. So this is part of the first installation. This is the output. This is a part of the second installation, which explore kind of joint tectonics. And this is the third installation, which explore the idea of manipulation of a space, which you can see here that all of them became public events. And the idea was to test architecture design as a kind of a didactic model to communicate the relationship between the everyday use of plastic and certain aspects of urbanization. Now, many exercises were done, and this is part of the appendix. We don't, I think, I say we because there's a group of like 7 to 200 people, depending on the installation, that helped me actually to produce all these things. So there were done many of these installations or material exercise. Some of them became installations, some of them died. So basically, yeah, what I wanted to say is that what I wanted to present is the very unstructured way of dealing with a PhD, making a lot of iterations that eventually became installations, and the installations were the vehicle to kind of connect me to theoretical arguments, which are split in 3 chapters. The first chapter, which deals with everyday material and the conformation of urban environments, which focus in the work of Fernand Braudel, and how there's a synergy between the conformation of certain aspects of infrastructure mainly, and the manipulation of things, of daily things. Chapter 2, which is much more than a material, explores plastic as a paradox, as a social paradox, looks at the good things of plastic, bad things of plastic, and through the exercise, so design exercise is trying to make people aware of these things. And the third chapter talks about manipulation process of everyday materials, which looks directly at how architecture has dealt with this. So it looks at architectural design methodologies. I kind of review in a very innocent way from Alberti all the way to Le Corbusier, trying to see where the material, how the material play a role within a creative role within manipulation processes. And basically, in this way, the thesis has two arguments. One is towards architecture and its inner processes, and the role of material, and how the physicality of our environment conditions also the way we structure ideas. And the other hypothesis, or the other kind of direction of the research is towards the process of urbanization and the physical environment, and has to do with pollution and other things, right? When I did this first installation, I'll just go very quickly through this. When I did this first installation, I actually didn't know where the research was going to go. My original idea was about, my original title was Process, Architecture and the Border Condition. I was very interested in process and other things. I did this first installation and realized that in Mexico, for every brick we produce 8 plastic bottles. So the volume in which we consume this material is gigantic, and the question this installation is trying to raise is to which point this is also part of the city, and to which point this also, or should be also, an architectural problem. And this kind of, the design in a way, or the manipulation, or the iterations, and the feedback I got from the people that participated in the installations, guided, in a way, the table of content. As you see, the first exercise was Nube Pet, and then it kind of built up until the conclusions and the introduction, which is the last things I wrote. That's pretty much it. Thanks.
Pretty good. Hello, I promise to be very quick, and I have my timer here, so everything's on time. My name is Milad, and I'm in my between second and third year of PhD. My title is Homeostatic Urban Assemblies, an evolutionary model for intelligent urban growth. I'm not going to go in detail what that means, but I'm going to explain it briefly, but rather I would like to talk about how I'm trying to organize my research. So these two tables of contents are, the one on the left is the one that I had my proposal officially submitted, and the one on the right is the one I had my mini viva, and they are actually quite drastically different, and the one on the left is very broad, and I was still looking at the very broad spectrum of the subjects, materials. One on the right, as you can see, I focused more on one specific moment of the one on the left, which is a biological process. Through that change, also my titles changed from the one on the top to the one on the bottom, which is vertical urban growth and homeostatic urban assemblies. But right now, I'm even like way back from what I had. And I'm actually right now in a blank page of table of content and trying to reorganize myself as I move forward. I don't even know if this is the right way of looking at my table of content as of now, but this is what I see myself pursuing the research and pushing it forward, which they all have like some progress for as far as I going forward. But this title, that right now I'm trying to, again, from those two tables of contents, try to emerge and create another table of contents more comprehensive and more accurate. So what I do, I look at these keywords one by one, and according to how I see my research can move forward, I prioritize them in order to investigate them accordingly.
This is how I see them to be investigated throughout my research, and all of them are quite in a different domains and disciplines. Some of them are in a natural science, biological processes, some of them in architecture and urban design, some of them most like computation again, and they're all overlapping with one on each other. And it's quite funny because I see my presentations are quite similar to the presentation that Mohammed just had, because I find myself and my research is quite related in the same triangle that Mohammed's research is situated. So I situate my research within these three domains, each of which has its own way of investigation for my research. This is how I move forward. For example, in the realm of biology and natural science, I predominantly use library and archive sources. And when it goes to the urban studies, I have two extensions, which is like a field and repository, and I explain why I have two. And then in the realm of computing and computation, I'm at my computer in a studio. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm just sitting at my computer. It's also the collective and group discussions that we have in our small group. Also, it is within the realm of a studio. So every one of these big chunks, they are also divided into different, again, further, more detailed sections, which each of them also have their own way of investigation, the way I move forward. For example, I started with intense studies and investigation in biological process that I'm very interested in. It's called homeostasis, which I briefly explain it later. Then it goes into how we use them into another discipline, which is architecture. It goes back to studio work, and then testing them, abstracting them in studio. And then there is another section, which is like a field. There's a dash line around it, which I'm not quite sure if my thesis at the end is going to conclude with the urban solution or just a model. That's why I'm not quite sure if I may conduct a field research eventually or not. Starting with that, it's just like I've been studying and taking courses, online courses on biology, reading a lot of biological books, try to understand what homeostasis means, try to abstract it, which is if I want to put it very simply, is like a feedback loop, which everywhere in like a biological process, everywhere in the nature, there is a feedback loop, which is actually homeostasis. And then again, try to understand how I can use and test that principle into my work. And that's when I go back to studio, and that's when I start like doing some design works. And how I can abstract it, then how can I use those abstractions in a way to inform my design and inform the other discipline rather than biology. Just moving forward, this is a step-by-step that I'm like going through right now. Start with library reading, intense investigation, then try to work some studio works, which is mostly my computer, and also collective discussions and group discussions that we have in the studio. Then it's just like a very simple investigation on how I'm investigating. I don't want to go through this diagrams, but this is the red dot that is there is my contribution, which into something that is already existed in the realm of computation. And with that have in mind, I try to test my ideas through two tests in order to see if it's possible to use something which is like a very important principle in biology into architecture. Then mathematical equations come to play, then design problems comes to play. I don't want to go in detail on what's happening there. I'm just like showing that design works started to emerge in my research in order to test if these studies that I've conducted is actually useful in architecture. And the studies is not just drawings, there are also statistical analysis, failures, successes, moving forward, more statistical analysis, simulations, which they eventually inform me whether something was successful or not. And again, at that stage was the stage that I could actually go out and publish what I've done in order to ensure myself the path that I'm taking is actually contributing to the knowledge and is useful. And then again, go back to one step before in order to restructure what I was thinking of the entire thesis structure again. The thing that I'm not quite sure yet is the part that I will be conducting a field work in my research, because I'm not quite sure the outcome still yet. But then if that is the case, then the chunk of the urban studies will eventually have the field work as well. And so, like, to recap whatever I've just said, there is a biological process called homeostasis I want to implement it in architecture. How I conducted this, I conducted a very intense studies and investigations, tried to understand what are the important principles, and tried to use them in architecture. And then those principles then inform me what to read and what to research and investigate more. So I see myself situated within these three big chunks of knowledge, but then as I move forward, they all divided into smaller parts, and I situate myself more in detail on how far in depth I want to go into any of them. And then at the end of the day, instead of having a very linear table of content, I find myself something like this, which is like everything is floating around. I don't know where I situate myself within, what are the principles, what are the disciplines I need to look at. And yes, this is where I'm at right now. I'm trying to situate myself, and still I think far way to go. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. If I can ask the session chair to join me at the table. You've actually done really well. I thought as a way into some attempts at synthesis and summary, I could at least announce sort of three initial reactions I've had to the afternoon's presentations. One is that inasmuch as the last symposium, What is PhD by Design, led to some realization that differentiation between the PhD and PhD by design after a certain point wasn't so critical or even discernible, I would say today it didn't matter after a certain point where across the curriculum these PhDs have been nursed, or indeed if these PhDs separate along the lines of these repository, field-based research, or studio-based. After a certain point, it didn't matter. So I don't know how effective these three sessions were in terms of genres of PhD. What we get in the end are individuals with a project, and they begin to cluster, and I think the word constellation was used in three different presentations. We did see constellations. So that's something we might talk about. Is there a reason we might want to articulate difference across PhD types or programs, or is that not so useful in the end? Another point, Ricardo spoke of the sympathy of words, which is a nice idea, the sympathy of words. I'd also say there's another thing boiling through most of the afternoon, which is the dominance of words, that no matter how architects try to reconfigure the terms of what a PhD might be, nomenclature, naming things, coming to terms with a table of contents where you have to enunciate in text what you are doing, that still dominates. So as much as architecture might have a task to try to subvert a PhD type, we are stuck within the conventions of the written dissertation, where words somehow might be sympathetic, but they might also be dominant. I thought that was particularly the way those slides ran over the second and third sessions. It just kept becoming more apparent that if you're not comfortable with words, if you're not fluid with changing the title or changing the table of context over time, something else might go seriously wrong. And then thirdly, we had the other Ricardo making an assertion with a kind of, I thought, really strong point, that the PhD is really the space of polemic. It's not just a space of collecting stuff. And I would like to ask, well, the panel really, to get going, if indeed in microcosm, the table of contents isn't always a place also of polemic. That the table of contents today that seem the most engaging were the ones that on one page seem to broadcast not just the content, but the argument. I'll turn it over. Maybe we could take these in order of the sessions today. Give the table over to Maria first, to some kind of synthesis.
I don't know if I can synthesize everything, but I'd like to respond to some of the related issues. I think Mark's right, and I think we need to assess, before we get to so there are tiers of problems, I think, that are raised by today's presentations, and the larger, more global issue is obviously how do we do research going from here? And as I alluded before, there's been a lot of debate at the turn of the century, what would be the relationship between architecture, right, as a professional practice versus an academic discipline? And a lot of assumptions went up into the air. And I think that the larger tier of how to understand the divisions and whether they should even exist, I think is a bigger problem of understanding where would the expertise be restored. Because if you know AA is a revolutionary experimental kind of school where a lot of the experimental models of doing research and then the pilot programs are created, which are then would be copied elsewhere. So with that comes the responsibility to lead the debate on what kind of research infrastructures to create and how they begin to actually get tested and splintered and reintegrated. The fact that there were very few schools, when I was grading my master's program, there were very few schools where you could do PhD by design. It was virtually impossible, and I remember considering either go to Harvard, Doctor of Design, or Stanford Engineering PhD because I was desperate to find. The field was blank. It's fascinating to see that the AA actually encourages, and I think with that comes a question, where would then be the sub-expertises and degree of clarity? So we're no longer fighting this eternal battle. You do art historical model, and I do a scientific experimental laboratory model, and could fight until I don't know who else comes home, but we will never agree, because there are external disciplines pushing on architecture to appropriate their methods. And we've seen how failures of really kind of superficial appropriation. The second tier of question, and I think it relates to what you referenced Ricardo's point. I think it's definitely true that what came across to me in a lot of presentations, that the content and the tools, the methodology are constantly polluting one another. And I think in some of the most promising kind of pitches is where I saw this ability to incorporate the feedback between what started, then what it ended up precipitating, the choice of methodological tools, the process of articulating research, and then changing the content, which then precipitated a change of methodology. So that figure is important because it's a project, it's a creative project. And that's where I think we should really try to move away from those fathering disciplines like art history or science. And the third point, again, I don't know if it's any help, but the much more local specific issue of table of contents. It's interesting to then talk, if we talk about feedback, how then more specifically, the type of work that was emerging then was calling for different types of tables of contents. And I don't just mean the loose, the field ones, the hierarchical ones, but also the kind. Like the dissertations that I dealt with, incorporation of modernity became phased. The table of contents become phases. In some cases, which is about the notion of understanding the old theory, defamiliarizing herself with it, and projecting new theory, right? In some way, it dictates the kind of moments within a table of contents. In some cases, perhaps it's these, yes, thematic clusters and constellations. I find it interesting, and I think genuinely we should project more richer diagrams that organize emerging knowledge and continuously to experiment with the flow.
Is it working? It's working, right? Maybe just following from Maria's explanation. I think that, first of all, I say that I don't have a PhD in a very kind of conscious state, and I also understand that all the students are exposing and exhibiting their work is a little bit like exposing an open nerve. You know, everything is on process, and I think a lot of these diagrams are very dear to you, in the sense you try to organize the research, your thoughts, what you like. But in a way, I'm very simpleton in the sense that I like to do what makes me excited when I wake up in the morning. in terms of subject. And what makes me excited in the morning is what I show you, the subject. So I try to keep that very close to me. And I think I've seen a lot this afternoon, which is not really a critique, because maybe that makes you excited during the day. But I think sometimes we tend to overcomplicate for this, not for the sake, because you're trying to perhaps organize to some level the research, and maybe that's what PhDs do to get to that rigor. But I also think that through this long process, which can go 3 to 6 years, maybe?
We've heard someone 8, 7?
4 years, right?
7.
Okay, so there's someone there. But I'm very interested on how, through all this research period, perhaps the table of content, or the idea of, for me, what works is naming. I know that creates a certain sense of gravity from where the other planets circulate around. Sometimes I put a lot of diagrams on my own sketchbook, and I question what we do, both in the unit and also the studio, about where the precision arrives, where the approximation to the desire of researching something appears. And I think perhaps we need more diagrams, but perhaps also there is a certain affiliation of a genealogy of words, a genealogy of themes that can create their own center of gravity around the subject. Because I have a lot of friends who did PhDs, and I have new friends now which are doing PhDs. And I think that tends to sometimes crumble inside the terminology or the verboseness, which was nice that I didn't hear so much today on the terms. So I think the idea that one can own knowledge, that can sort of create terms from what the other terms gravitate around, I think is quite refreshing sometimes when we start researching something and realize that the bibliography is like a mammoth. And of course, to start, you have to cover a field. But to other extent, when you mirror that after the initial research, you can also make those authors gravitate around your own interest. And I think it sounds obvious, but it's not obvious for all of us who write and publish. But yeah, it's not. That's what I have to say, the idea that this combination between where methodology becomes destructive and where a certain level of spontaneity has to emerge in order for create refreshment.
Yeah, you had pointed out in your presentation this ambition that the creative arc of the dissertation could be imaginative and inconclusive. And maybe that's a part of, we were looking at how things were ending in my kind of pub quiz options, but I was also looking at where, particularly the students who were very close to defending their dissertation, how that conclusion was organized. And it's kind of fascinating how some of you had written the conclusion before the 3rd chapter, depending on the chronology of your work, not being the chronology of the table of contents. Moni.
Yes, I mean, similar as Ricardo, I don't have a PhD as well, but I've been investigating specific topic for many years with a group of people. I mean, I'm not saying that is similar. What I want to try, before when I was talking about the studio, what I was trying to say is that even if we think that a PhD, it is a polemical, let's say, always trying to put forward a polemical investigation, what does it mean to make a choice of doing it here at the AA? If we have this flexibility that we can actually challenge what a PhD student might need, why you don't tell us? That's why I was saying before, if we need expertise, if you say, yes, in order for me to actually put forward a specific idea, specific project, specific thesis, I would like to have a specific expertise. We need to know. So, I mean, I'm talking about, when I say we, because I'm a tutor here, so I always I tell the students, speak up. So for me, it's that one. Like I say, if we need to have works that are actually making an effect, we need to know much more how we can construct this reaction not only at the end of the thesis, but actually while the work is taking place. So that's why I was talking about we should work much more with expertise. We should see if there is a way of having authors be present, or if we need to work in a different environment, etc. For instance, like many of you are working with really interesting questions. Somehow, we don't know. I don't know what are the questions that are driving your thesis. Tell us. I would say, there are some of the questions that I'm curious about it. So I would say, why you don't, I don't know, send me an email. Sometimes send an email to the tutor and say, these are the questions I'm working with. Do you know if anybody has the same interest? So for me, it's that one, more opening up this idea of having conversations. Well, I have already a few of you that I would email next week because I need you to see if we can investigate some topics together. But that's for me, that's what I was trying to point out, that we have resources, but if we don't speak up, we always leave it at the end, and we say, yes, we have a PhD thesis that is going to be kept in the library, and someone's going to read it, and is going to find its relevance. I don't think it's enough. I think we need to start to build it more as a process as well, and not just as at the end.
Well said. By way of a feedback loop to the people that prepared for today and opened their nerves, I thought we could look at, yes, this question in the first session about ordering principles. David talked about his synchronic structure to organizing the PhD. Sophia questioned, where do we begin, where do we end, with her Star Wars analogy. Is it all right to start in the middle? Is it more productive to start in the middle? Ricardo talked about his introduction stretching to 100 pages or thereabouts, and sponsoring chapters, allowing one thing to grow and become more than the anticipated proportion of the final project. And then lastly, I thought Alvaro, with his board, exemplified this notion that every PhD is a kind of Warburgian library mind palace, and it's constantly updated. It's constantly also rooted to, in his postcard analogy, how architects think through images. Even when they're doing something as text-based as a PhD, I thought that was a really kind of beautiful way of summarizing our unique approach, going back to Maria's charge that we have to begin to announce what a PhD might be like, and that was an interesting illustration.
But also I think because if we think when a visual is a bit kind of replace the word, what is the reason why sometimes we use a visual? So we say, it's not a question of PhD by design or not. For me, it's always a question when the words are not able to explain something, then we might use the visual. So there is also sometimes the use of a different medium just in order to make more clear a point.
But in a way, it's similar to the studio situation, except it's just in the unit, it happens a lot faster. The students are taught methods and tools in order to challenge them and unlearn them and invent their own. And I think what was really beautiful about those heuristic devices is that they're not just borrowed or learned from elsewhere, they're constructed within the project, and then they drive the project forward. And the more cycles of revision the author would allow, I think the more productive it would be. And it was really beautiful to see the inner kitchen of that, because it's often invisible in the final product somehow.
And maybe something also to distinguish between, I think, going back and returning to the idea of the polemics, that to what extent, based from the 60s onwards, the idea of the autobiographical part of the thesis is constructive, and to what extent that kind of, sometimes there is also the, almost like you have to tick a box to have a polemic, and sometimes that polemic comes too fast. And I don't know if I agree with that idea of the polemic. I do agree with having interesting subjects that perhaps you don't know where you're going to go. I do agree with I have a level of autobiographical interest to enlighten a more travel path of epistemology somewhere in anthropology, archaeology, or computer science. But at the same time, I think that sometimes we are at tables in intermediate where I teach here, and sometimes there is a bit of an overemphasis on you gotta be radical or you gotta be polemical, and sometimes on the imaginary, there is some projects would do that, but sometimes a project might be absolutely opposite and might refresh the field. So I wouldn't, maybe for some people that works, a lot of people think that works for me, but in fact it doesn't. I think that idea of, otherwise it can generate a status quo about being different, which is also in this place, I think can become a bit of a historical trap because we are in 2018. And I think the next big thing is going to come out of some of you. It's going to come out of some of your idiosyncrasies and some of that different tables of contents on different outputs that you might generate. So I think that level of extrovertness, that some of your thesis might reach some people. For example, you're talking about going back on the real world versus... So I think maybe the polemic is how you extrovert that thesis and bring some players, and that by then you create your own history. And that cautionary speech comes from a book by Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote The Fight Club. And he wrote in his book about celebrities, it's a fiction. He talks about everyone is trying to create the mythology of themselves. And sometimes there is an overemphasis on that historical effect. And but I think it's also a balance between that constant critique, that feedback loop, and some kind of more natural path, I would say.
But this external aspect was at the core of the debate about the relevance of theory, and in fact the ability of theory to survive in the 90s and 2000s, because in a way we've shifted now. We used to debate between critical and projective, right? For example, if you still remember, in American kind of circles, there was this divide between, for example, understanding that the role of history and theory is to, in a way, understand the past and critically, in a way, create a space of polemical position with relationship to the past, whereas the projective camp argued for the immediate ability to project future scenarios and future applicability. But I think now we're moving into much more, even more difficult situation where simply being projective is just not enough. Apparently everybody's projective. So now it's a question of not just being speculative, but also being understanding where's the field of action, what's the agency of the work. Yeah, so I mean, we all agree that we need to look forward. We all agree that simply historical survey is very, very different to sell in today's intellectual marketplace. But where do you see the field of action of the work is very difficult, because it's not, it then brings and I have no answers to these questions, because it brings a much more long-term problem of intellectual output that goes for millennia, which is the market doesn't always call the worthy intellectual projects in which to engage, and it becomes a very twisted conversation.
If we think of session 2, and I think some of this question of the autobiography or authorship started to be challenged there, and in the 3rd session, somebody talked about why is it about one investigator ultimately for the PhD. But in session 2, Andrea admitted that not only was the table of contents for her always changing, but that she almost pulled out of presenting it in that kind of fluidity. But then I thought she said something very nice, that sometimes she laughs at her own thesis, that you go through stages, right, with a 3 or 4 year relationship where you're in love with, you fall out of love with, and you come to terms with your own dissertation. And everyone seemed to be at different stages. Those who are nearly at the viva, are also about ready to have a divorce, and they're going to be they're already thinking of the next project, right, the next great hurdle. But I thought that was a nice an aside from Andrea that was telling. Mohammed talked about how you diagram domains, and how each domain then sponsors a kind of new worlds, fractals, if you will, intellectual cascade effect. That seems a natural part of not, as you say, bringing the context. There's a process of discovery that wasn't guided just by the polemic, but about triggers associated with working in archives, finding new things, or being challenged by peers and advisors. We didn't hear a lot about advisors today, I must say. Jay talked about that at the end of the dissertation, at the end of all this field research and process, chapter 6 was the test, that one way to conclude something is to test it and evaluate it. That was an interesting idea, going back to the idea, how do you finish something? Maybe you just have to test it.
And I think like again, I'm just putting things on the table. When, I don't remember the name of the students now, the one with the three sphere, the three different disciplines.
Mohammed, yeah.
I mean, maybe it was just the way, like the word sometimes can be misleading, because the word was like, I looked at a different field and I looked at the literature. And I was like, why do we always need to go through words? why we don't need to go through project, through work, through, I don't know, patents, or, so for me it's always like with what do we engage? I mean, of course, if we work with archive, we're dealing maybe with visual images and text, but there are other things that maybe we can work with, and I think kind of opening up much more and make it more part of what is the investigation. It should be more embraced. I don't think sometimes in a PhD is embraced. I think the students do an amazing job on actually going around and looking for the different fields, but I think they can be sometimes supported much more on so just even working with the different expertise.
Yeah, I think just maybe a couple of comments just because I was part of that group. But just to start, I think it was really exciting to see the diversity. You know, there was, I think, Andre, you're from History and Theory, right? And the other, Mohammed and Jay are from MTech, correct? So it's quite interesting that around that congregation of thematics, no, the idea of perhaps representation was unspoken, but it was quite present about, sometimes there is the pressure of how that table of content should look. And I think, for example, in your case, Andre, was how I thought was quite interesting how you were connecting, spatially, and suddenly the table of content becomes a drawing. But what I enjoy is that the drawing, you can guide us through that drawing. No, I think there is recognition, there is steps to understand, and I think even the tapering, no, the axial element is connected to the thematic. I think that is, I think simple moves like this are what the simple moves in design lead us to certain certainties, no? And I think that was quite refreshing. I think, I'm glad that in Mohammed's case, the simulations or animations worked, and unfortunately on Jay, perhaps it didn't work. I was about to shout, like, you have to close the PDF and open again. And normally it reboots the problem. But I thought it was interesting that I'm fascinated by the research of the MTech, because I think it does something that, from a different point of view from what I do. You know, I tend to look at the environments, and it's part of my passion. But I look from the point of view of culture, and with some factor of interaction and computation, but to a lesser degree than the MTech. So I think for me it's always interesting and curious to see what the potentials to externalize that research is. For example, how can the simulation nowadays in 2018 perhaps communicate or be shown in a way that is not necessarily the computational aspect of simulation, no? But is actually part of a partial conclusion because I think the process is super good for you guys which are developing that at this point. But I'm always wondering to what extent the ways that we show it, the same thing, because it's showing on your thesis, you can also kind of refresh the same thematic, no? That's why things tend to be cyclical. We tend to talk about similar subjects, but because someone is showing in a different way, because that theme, no, embrace and bring something new, suddenly the method of representation from something which is a computational calculation or simulation is shown differently. I'm looking at you, but unfortunately I haven't seen it yet, but so it's just an assumption.
The third session opened up what we might call glitches, typical things we trip over that some people might capitalize on. Nena talked about Lucas giving or misinterpreting one of her figures as the diagram of her table of contents, and instead of offering that up as a problem, she took it as an inducement to perhaps imagine if that's true. So going back to the diagram as an analogy of a table of contents. Arturo, I thought beautifully represented in his table that the order of work is not the order of a table of contents, that you have this fluidity of time available. A table of contents might be reorganized multiple ways, and its flows, which loop back, I think, to some of Sophia's point about where in sequence, could always be changed. And if you are writing distinctive chapters that are somewhat autonomous, you have more flexibility then in those systems to reorganize, which was the kind of beautiful point made by Milad at the end, talking about publication as proof, that between beginning the PhD and sitting for your viva, there are other opportunities to test the work in smaller forms, but in public fields. And I thought the publication, which we hadn't talked a lot about up until that point, was one way through, and that was a collaborative publication. But that starts to, I think, set up some degrees of confidence that would then help the viva itself. But that was a collective work. We've talked about single authorship, the autobiography, teamwork, particularly in the studio-based session, talked about what is this collaborative nature, how does it flow into a PhD? What do we do with that as architects? The one or the many?
I mean, for me, it was more like if the topic is complex that you need other expertise, you just look for the expertise. And so it's not really too much. So I never say like it's either one way or another way, it's either PhD by design, or it's just more like what is actually needed at that specific moment. Let's be flexible enough and have a system that is malleable that allows actually to constantly adapt our work. And that's why I think that's why it was great even to show on what Milad was showing of actually putting out the work and see what is the reaction or the need or the relevancy of the specific moment. So for me, that is the main reason.
I think that is interesting because I think some of the table of contents, when the design appeared, and I always had a bit of a difficulty to see a PhD by design in terms of my expectations or on what is outputted, but I always think that as a designer, I think when the output appears, or the part of the output or the process which is sketched from a table of content, from a simulation to the installations, I think for me, it shouldn't be, and I'm talking about what makes me wake up in the morning happy, it shouldn't be necessarily a symmetrical exercise in terms of matching the words. Because I think once the thought of the production, which is written and designed, and I don't mean text design at this point, I think if one aims for the behavior of the design to symmetrically respond to the questions of the text, I think then the design comes as a conclusion already taken. No, it comes as a part of the process which already is like when you go studying certain, to minimize it, to summarize the conversation, when you study ornament by the simple understanding, the depiction, that means that shield, those words mean. So there's a very claustrophobic symmetry when the design appears on that way. So what I try to do on my own work with the students is to try to think, which we simply call asymmetrical thinking. How can some questions of the design are actually there to be asymmetrical? They are there to open and to not to be fully compelled into the world of the same text or what the text is saying, but it's actually more open doors. Some things are unsaid because you can't describe everything about a drawing or a model or a film or a photograph. So I think that's quite an interesting way to perhaps stimulate that idea that perhaps the design part of the PhD by design is more asymmetrical than symmetrical.
But there's moments of glitch and accident. I'd like to extend it to the relationship between these three types of research and again the question whether the rigid distinction is productive. I don't think it's a coincidence that in the third session there was much more of a acknowledgement of the switching between different kinds of research throughout the course of, I would argue, those still emergent models of producing research through PhD by design here at the Bartlett is relatively young. Programs that do it in the United States, again, are not yet fully tested in terms of the generational transfer. So I think it's really important to understand that where, and I think it relates then to a question of production, testing, iteration, dissemination, and kind of maybe reappropriation and readjustment. Because if you sometimes need to do the research, and the question is why literature? Oftentimes in the conventional PhD model, you do need to identify a gap in the literature to even justify the life of your PhD, which sometimes you do afterwards. After you have a product, you need to place it. And there's a reason I'm saying it's not an accident, it happens in a so-called studio-based model. And I do believe personally, I might say I was wrong 10 years from now, I do believe that architectural design studio as a general idea of a kind of platform that allows for these different kinds of research to constantly switch on and on is extremely unique and productive. And you can oftentimes immerse yourself in the literature halfway through your experimental project, uncover a very important subfacet, and then engage with experimentally. The same goes for publication and other forms of dissemination, because again, I would like to alert us to the fact that it used to be understood that architects make architectural drawings, or ideally buildings, and architectural historians write books. Just how far we've gone from that crude division, I think, is fascinating. And we had today mentions of blogs. Yeah. We've had researchers engaging in basically artistic projects and installations. We have publications in collaborative academic article, books by tutors and students at the AA. So I think there's a fascinating variety of ways to test the project, not necessarily at the final phase.
Yeah, well said. I think at this point it'd be nice to open the floor to some, I won't say questions, because I don't know if you have questions. We've had a kind of long series of presentations today and some summary, but we have people in the audience who are a few months into the PhD project or a few years. I'm really curious about the people embarking on their second year, because at about that time, you really start to feel that a table of contents is something you have to start to grapple with. But if not questions, it'd be nice to have some feedback loop from the audience in terms of things that you thought were remarkable about the presentations today, or problematic, or as they relate to your own work. Because I think oftentimes you're sitting in an audience, there's certain presentations that triggered an association with your own method or organization or content that resonated with you in a particular way. Maybe you weren't expecting that. But let's open the floor. Any questions, comments, or confessions? Yes. There you are.
Thank you for the set of presentations. I'm not actually doing my PhD at the moment, but I just have a question regarding table of contents. And to what extent should the table of contents reveal the research and the outcomes of the work, but at the same time encourage people to still want to go and read the document rather than finding out everything that they want to know just through the table of contents because of the kind of organization of, you know, how it began and how it would end?
I think I can't answer because I'm not one of the presenters, but I loved, is it Alvaro? I loved his map because it's like the Borges' map. When his table of contents becomes as big as his book, he wouldn't have to open it anymore. So he carries it around in his bag and he keeps adding to the table of contents. As soon as the table of contents is exactly the same as his PhDs, he wouldn't have to use the table of contents.
If I can, maybe I don't have an answer because it depends a lot. So there are two things here. What I have presented is more table of contents as for the research, in a way. So not the table of contents as for the reader, which is a question that I have of also what is it that you transmit on this first page. So regarding that, there is, when I was looking at Raymond Roussel, is the last, this French author that had the idea like having super grid in a way, or like planning all the work. It's a bit like Georges Perec. There is a scaffold that is behind, and it's about the production of the work, but that doesn't correspond with the actual text. So what happens is that after 20 years maybe of Raymond Roussel publishing the book, and everyone getting crazy, like, what is this about? It's a super strange book. The surrealist saying, oh, this is a proto-surrealist kind of writer. And he then died, but after dying, he published a diary of how he planned and wrote some of the books. It was a very strange thing because it's like completely planned, predicted, and not surrealist at all way of writing. But the final product is very different, and the interface with the reader So that's another question that I think is good to open, which is to think how you transmit that table of content, or what is the text about, or how do you transmit the research? I mean, this is I think there is no one answer, obviously, but I think it's a space of production also that you can transmit it in a very different way. I don't know, it's not a great answer, but I think, yeah, there is not of correspondence between the production tool and the final table of contents.
I think maybe to simplify, if you think that you are the author, but at the same time you're also the reader. So in a way, you just need to, I always find it strange when we think too much about there is an audience out there and we need to think about the audience, like how they're going to react to specific work. I would say, well, actually, you are the author, but you are also the audience. You should trust yourself. You should write a table of content that you want to open and read. So you need to be a bit schizophrenic and have this kind of true character of being the author and then switch off a bit and imagine you're actually the reader as well. And trust yourself in a sense.
There is a lot of heat on a few pages of the freshly bound dissertation. You sort of have this thing, you're very proud. You haven't quite had your viva yet, but you pass it round and people immediately jump to two sections. It's always the same two. One, of course, is the table of contents. They want a kind of quickie. It doesn't give the show away, but it certainly helps guide. If you find yourself in that table of contents, you might chapter jump and channel surf, and maybe that's all right.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, I was just going to say, and the other page everyone jumps to, and it was featured on 3 of these presentations, of course, the acknowledgements. People want to know if they've been recognized. If you ever asked for anything from anyone and they ever responded, you have to keep a running tally for 4 years and make sure everyone's in your acknowledgements because everyone will read it anyway.
It's true. I mean, I've been, so I didn't do a PhD or anything, but I've been writing quite a lot of table of contents of, as well, one book. But the way I was testing it was a similar way. I was just putting sometimes students, sometimes colleagues inside the room and just film them and see where their eyes go first. You know, because if I am inside the room with them, they're just going to be kind of behaving politely and go through the entire thing. So I did this kind of test to see like what actually they capture more, you know, like, and that was actually a way as well for me to edit out quite a lot of other stuff that maybe then was irrelevant or was just too much of background information. I think maybe it's also a way of, in that way, testing this way.
Comment there. Can we get a mic? Thanks.
I was present at the discussion earlier this year on the PhD by design, so I'm very interested to follow this. One thing I would ask is about the word dissertation and the affiliated word thesis, which I've not quite heard enough of. In discussing table of contents, there's always something that actually really, I would have thought, should precede it, which is what the thesis actually is, or what it's asserting. Now, the word dissertation is unfortunate because it doesn't seem to connect to a simple verb, to dissert. You can insert, you can assert, but what is it to dissert? And normally in a conventional discipline, the dissertation or thesis proposes an argument. It might be highly polemic in the spirit of Carl's idea. A problem with design theses is what is it to dissert something, to put it forward. When one puts forward an argument in history or logic or mathematics, it is subject to certain kinds of understandable rigors of criticism and argument. The problem, it seems to me, to recur with anything that brings in design is that it seems to require a different kind of verb, a different meaning to the verb, to assert. What is it that you are proposing? The word thesis used to be used a great deal for diploma theses in the final year of architectural education. And it always struck me as a curious and very idiosyncratic use of that term, thesis, to put forward a design as a thesis. So I just wondered if preceding the table of contents, or at least at the top of the page, should be some notion of what is it to state your dissertation.
While I have this talk hanging in my head, I will start before it disappears. I will answer, perhaps I'll comment more regarding the idea of thesis. And I always thought that there was a thought somehow along in the school, and that's perhaps not connected to PhD, that the students had to have their thesis, no, in order to have the design. And something quite incredible happened in this period, which I don't think was very fruitful, which was the idea that somehow, in some cases, people spend a lot of time trying to formulate a thesis, and then the design became an illustration of that thesis with a high degree of quality, almost undiscussable, because the thesis was quite strong. But again, the output was highly complementary to that, which I'm sure that's not the right way of doing thesis, but that's what a lot that happens, at least in my view. And something interesting is, I don't know what, perhaps my colleagues will talk more about the idea of insertion, dissertation, but I think the idea of when one experiments with something, one tests and observes and notes and create and articulate elements around, and then around 2/5 of the journey, a table of content appear, some kind of words which can create a gravity around these appears. I always thought that that was the camp that I thought was more fruitful in a way in the design studio, where accountability, if we can say that word, in terms of what is being put forward in terms of design is not just some kind of submissive element for a highly strong but claustrophobic thesis. So I'm sure there's super exciting ways of doing thesis, but that was not one of them.
Yeah, I think it's important that we both acknowledge the search for new ways. I mean, I'm sure there's a way to give a more rigorous definition, the way it is understood from an academic point of view, academic discipline. But I think what Ricardo was just talking about really makes me think that the whole point of, for example, for us in the diploma school, is to keep the pressure for the final project, especially for the 5th year, to have some element of what thesis used to do. And I think it's really, really important in the final year of education. What it means, well, I don't really know what that means, but I do know that if they can take a clear position and they construct a theoretical model of the world, they can articulate that model with, and Ricardo's right, the design elements shouldn't be a sidekick illustration, and maybe it should be slightly more than a very responsible, retroactive understanding of what you've designed. I think it should be much more productive relationship between the two. And I think from that we can then look at the much broader range, depending on where you are in the school and which tutors are you mentored by, whether there's a lot more accountability or kind of maybe prospective theorization going on, and from there maybe new definitions of that. Like I said, if you compare us to historians or scientists, we will always fall short. And so we need to defend the ability to redefine what they mean in an experimental school of architecture.
I think to go to your question, where do you announce the argument relative to the table of contents? Sponsors all sorts of reactions, I'm sure. Some students are wary to put it in their introduction, as it kind of gives the game away. Some feel it belongs as a conclusion, as if you're reading a novel and there's something spectacular at the end that offers up, I think, that projective or heuristic opportunity of the dissertation. If you had to announce it in front of the table of contents itself, you would be maybe in a very different position of how to order that table of contents. So I think to construct an argument or a series of arguments, we heard a little bit of that idea today, is part of the alchemy of the dissertation, but it also must have this projective element you brought up, and I think you were hinting that it could be more, that there's something beyond that that we still have to grapple with. And maybe those projects are in the room. And maybe it goes to the point that the argument, the rhetorical device that sponsors the table of contents might not be singular, but might be dispersed across the series of chapters that then have to be read as an aggregate in order to get to something like the conclusion. We have time for one more question before luscious drinks are served. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi. It's not really a question, but I just want to share our experience because we are starting our second year with PhD, and we just had our field work in Thailand. So, right after we finished our field work, the thing that in the proposal, my draft table of content, the thing that I put as the last chapter, the thing that I think it is interesting, but I don't really know where should it be. Right now, it's come to the first priority after the field trip. And without realizing, and we just had our last supervisions with our second supervisor in Bangkok. So instead of thinking of building a table of content or starting doing it, we are thinking of building drawers to put our materials from the field work, so we are constructing our drawers and then think it as which drawer we should put materials in and where should it be, and which material can be put in, like some material can be put in many drawers, not just one. And I just want to share the idea of how we build our table of content right now, and it will be our structure of the thesis.
I think it ties back nicely to the image we had of the Warburg Library, that every PhD project, if we don't use the word dissertation, assumes a kind of mind palace or a space to be creative. The Warburg is explicit. Your drawers, right, will start to concretize what is this kind of intellectual project. It's nice that they sponsor this through field research, because you were talking about field research. Surely everyone has drawers, if not literal, figural, as they begin to organize their dissertation. Does it become useful for you to have something tactile? Does it help you organize? Do each of those drawers represent ultimately a kind of chapter or a subdivision of the larger project? You're still making the drawers, that's all right. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's virtually represent chapters, but we are not, I'm not so sure whether it will be a chapter or not, but right now we just came back from a field work. I feel like I've got so much materials, and right now I have to categorize them and put them in the right place, find the right place for it. And it will be a chapter or a sub-chapter. It will be in a future room.
My guess is you need those drawers because you're working not just with texts and citations or photography that you've done, but you've collected ephemera. And we haven't talked about that. We've talked about archives. We haven't talked about the nature of the materials in those archives. What's beautiful, for example, about some of the archives mentioned today is their inclusion of ephemera, things around projects, playbills, tickets, the handwritten note, correspondence, and how all those feed. I think that's part of the beautiful discovery and indulgence of PhD research. And ultimately, everyone needs archives to support their work. They might not be labeled as such, but the fact that people, even 2 years in, are connected with 2 and 3 major archives, the fact that several of you are using the AA archives in some form, probably speaks not just to the usefulness of looking at flat images, but finding stuff you didn't expect to find. And ephemera might be one of the reasons why you need the physical drawers, because there are grades of material that aren't going to necessarily flatten on your computer, but have to be sort of pinned to your blue board.
Yeah, maybe, it's not, I know you don't want a tutorial, but I think what is nice is perhaps to really take that as an exercise. If you're doing a drawer, and you're bringing actually not just papers but materials that you collect, these materials also have a transfer from you to this drawer. So I think the way and the depth and how these things will change throughout the terms, you might draw this very different. You might not buy, or you might not draw similar to IKEA. You might, one day a piece of brick will be on the top drawer, but then you decided that it changes to the third drawer. So it sounds kind of very simplistic, but in a way you might, if you think your table of contents / drawer will change, what are the mechanisms based on your research that this will stimulate you to generate change? Is there a hole there? Is there something that you have to lit something every day or every 3 months? There is an alarm clock that you have to open that. So I think the mechanism of design, which is what we call like every idea has consequences, no? I think every idea doesn't come alone. From large ideological ideas to kind of let's make something. So like design, what are perhaps some consequences and some step 1 and 2 that this materialization of your organization of materials could stimulate interchange? Otherwise, normally when you say, oh man, I'm so stuck. I mean, I've been put in a drawer. So I think you don't want that connotation. I think maybe based on your research, how this can stimulate a constant interchange and a reassessment perhaps.
I think also like in relation to the table of contents, now because we were talking that what I find that I would be curious to see with some of you is a few table of contents. One, for example, is the table of content that show clearly what are the material, the physical material that you investigate with for each chapter. Another table of content, I would like to know how much did it cost for you just to travel, go to see specific things for that specific chapter. I want to know which is the chapter more expensive. I want to know which is the chapter that you work with most amount of people, which is the chapter that you are dealing with different type of material. I think there are many table of content that we can have, and they start almost generate, open up kind of different type of curiosity and different type of investigation.
I think we're totally in tutorial mode, so I'm gonna join. Okay, so what you should, but genuinely, I think it's really exciting to have this cross section. And the reason we are design tutors, we're all like ready to go, is because there's a wonderful, miraculous power of innocence that you can have in studio. And I think we can see more of it occurring across doctoral programs. As I said, let's reassert ourselves as the most experimental school. Who said we need to have chapters? Who said we cannot switch between emergent technologies, mode of research, to histories and theory, and back to emergent technologies? Who is to say that that analog atlas cannot turn into digital database and become a collaborative project and a blog and then go back to an atlas and an extremely personal and intimate investigation? I think what's beautiful about it, and again, I may be, extremely naive and optimistic person, but the reason I've tested it is that you can tell this to students, like, okay, for Monday, I'd like to have a history of programming in the 20th century, and they say, okay. And they come with it on Monday morning. They have no idea that it's impossible. They have no idea that they will peel all the wrong precedents, but they actually produce it. And so in the first year, I've seen some of the most incredible new categories. Koolhaas is completely obsolete with his elements because the students in a week reinvent new elements of architecture. That happens in first year because they're not encumbered by what they must be doing and what the tradition it weighs them with. So what's beautiful about the A, so we can throw things in the air somewhat, even in the most advanced stages of education, without perhaps complete lack of accountability. So I think in a tutorial mode, absolutely we should have more crossover, more experimentation, and challenging the structures and modes of delivering that research.
I think just to complement what my colleague said is maybe as a suggestion for Mark and everyone at the PhD, how you can stimulate methods of exchange that take some of those ideas forward, for everyone, because I think we know that doing this conference is absolutely amazing, sometimes mind-blowing, but then your mind blows literally afterwards because you don't know what to do immediately. So we do somehow expand the possibilities in a disfavor for the sequence of. But I think that's really interesting how perhaps to stimulate some of these conversations, which we're suggesting, how there is a different protocol of exchange of these ideas, no? I know because I think we colleagues. My unit space is just beside the PhD, or is PhD room. I think that you guys changed.
The former PhD room.
Former PhD room. I'm still in the danger. I'm still in the danger. But yeah, so I think it's just a suggestion that I know that on the day-to-day, this practice has changed, but maybe some new elements of vertical crossing will stimulate some of those different types of exchange.
I dare say one of the more instrumental ways of achieving that is to integrate all faculty in supervision of PhD. I shouldn't say the word faculty. The AA doesn't have faculty. We have teaching staff. Integrate them across all PhD supervision. Let me thank the organizers of the event again, Lucas, Milad, Alif. But let me thank the AA PhD program full stop. We don't get together like this so often. And when we do, it's productive. That you all have a new and improved space, a home, this year that's in a very special position, speaks to the school's, I think, commitment and understanding that the AA PhD program as a whole is a big part of the school, intellectually, culturally, and literally. And when we do get together, it feels like we're going to move from strength to strength, and this was a part of that today. Thanks to our session chairs. Thank you, all three. And on to drinks in the South Jury Room. Thanks a lot.
One glass of wine.
There are no drinks.
I was like, what?